Welcome, friend, to this peaceful journey through one of history's most captivating dynasties. Tonight, we're stepping into the glittering ballrooms and shadowed corridors of Imperial Russia, where the Romanov family ruled for over 3 centuries before their world came crashing down. Whether you're settling in for the night or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful you're here with me as we explore this remarkable story together. Picture yourself walking through the Winter Palace on a crisp St. Petersburg morning in 1613. The air carries the scent of beeswax candles and rich fabrics, while servants hurry through marble hallways, preparing for another day in the life of Russia's newest ruling family. This is where our story begins. Not with grand battles or political machinations, but with the quiet moments that shaped an empire. Michael Romanov was barely 16 when the crown was placed upon his head. And if you could have seen him that morning, you might have wondered how this shy, almost reluctant young man would become the founder of Russia's most enduring dynasty. He stood before an ornate mirror in his private chambers, watching as attendants adjusted the heavy ceremonial robes that seemed to dwarf his slender frame. The weight of the crown was nothing compared to the weight of expectation that settled on his shoulders. His mother, Martha, had opposed his coronation with the fierce protectiveness of a woman who had already seen too much political turmoil. She understood what the rest of Russia was only beginning to grasp. The time of troubles had left the country exhausted, divided, and desperate for stability. Foreign armies had occupied Moscow. Pretenders had claimed the throne, and noble families had torn each other apart in their hunger for power. The Romanov name represented hope for a new beginning. But hope is a fragile thing when you're 17 years old, and the fate of millions rests in your hands. Michael's daily routine in those early years reveals the extraordinary transformation of a reluctant ruler into the architect of dynastic greatness. Each morning began before dawn with prayers in his private chapel where golden icons seemed to watch over him with ancient eyes. The young Tsar would kneel on the cold stone floor, his breath visible in the winter air, seeking guidance from saints who had protected Russia through centuries of invasion and upheaval. After prayers came the endless stream of boyars, merchants and foreign ambassadors who filled his receiving halls. Michael had learned to read faces as carefully as he read official documents, understanding that survival in the Russian court required distinguishing between genuine loyalty and convenient allegiance. The men who bowed before him each morning represented families whose fortunes had risen and fallen with previous dynasties, and their elaborate courtesies barely concealed the calculating minds that assessed every royal decision for potential advantage. The palace kitchens during Michael's reign were a world unto themselves, where dozens of cooks prepared meals that served both sustenance and statecraft. Breakfast might include fresh bread from the palace bakeries, honey from monastery apiaries, and exotic fruits that had traveled thousands of miles along trade routes that connected Russia to distant lands. But even these simple pleasures carried political weight, as the choice of which merchants supplied the royal table could elevate families or destroy competitors. Michael's afternoons were spent in council meetings that stretched for hours in chambers lined with maps showing the vast territories that comprised his domain. These weren't abstract political discussions, but urgent conversations about real problems affecting real people. Reports arrived daily from provincial governors describing everything from Cossack raids along the southern borders to crop failures that threatened winter survival in northern villages. The young Tsar would lean over detailed maps, tracing borders with his finger, while advisors explained the complex relationships between different ethnic groups, religious communities, and economic interests that made governing Russia such an intricate challenge. Every decision rippled outward through a network of relationships that connected the palace to remote villages where peasants had never seen their ruler, but whose lives depended on his choices. Evenings in the palace revealed the more intimate side of royal life, where Michael could momentarily set aside the burden of ruling to engage in pursuits that reminded him he was still a young man learning to navigate an impossible role. He enjoyed reading chronicles of Russian history, finding both inspiration and warning in the stories of previous rulers who had succeeded or failed in their attempts to unify and strengthen the realm. The palace library became his refuge during these evening hours, where candle light flickered across leather-bound volumes that contained centuries of accumulated wisdom about governing, warfare, diplomacy, and human nature. Michael developed the habit of making notes in the margins of books, creating a personal commentary on leadership that reflected his growing understanding of the complexities involved in ruling an empire. His marriage to Eudoxia Strekhnova in 1626 transformed not only his personal life but the entire atmosphere of the court. The wedding celebration lasted for weeks with festivities that demonstrated the renewed prosperity and stability that the Romanov dynasty was bringing to Russia. Foreign dignitaries attended ceremonies that showcased Russian culture. orthodox traditions and imperial magnificence in ways that announced the country's return to the community of European powers. Eudoxia brought her own perspective to palace life, establishing routines and traditions that would influence royal customs for generations. Her morning prayers were longer and more elaborate than Michael's, reflecting a deep spirituality that shaped her approach to the responsibilities of queenship. She understood that royal women wielded power through influence rather than authority, and she cultivated relationships with noble families, religious leaders, and foreign ambassadors that provided Michael with invaluable intelligence about court dynamics and popular opinion. The birth of their children, particularly the future Tsar Alexis in 1629, created new rhythms of family life within the formal structure of imperial protocol. Palace nurseries were established with careful attention to both comfort and security, as the survival of royal heirs was essential for dynastic continuity. Wet nurses were selected not only for their health and character but for their family backgrounds and political connections, as even the most intimate aspects of royal child care carried implications for future alliances and rivalries. Michael's relationship with his son revealed the tender humanity beneath the imperial facade. Palace servants would observe the Tsar playing with young Alexis in private apartments, teaching him to read church Slavonic texts and explaining the significance of religious icons that decorated every room. These moments of fatherly instruction were simultaneously personal bonding experiences and essential preparation for future leadership responsibilities. The administrative work that consumed much of Michael's time provides fascinating insights into the practical challenges of governing a vast, diverse empire with limited communication systems and transportation infrastructure. Daily reports from provincial administrators arrived weeks or even months after the events they described, requiring the Tsar to make decisions based on information that might already be obsolete by the time it reached the capital. Michael developed systems for managing this administrative complexity that became models for future rulers, establishing regular correspondence schedules with regional governors and creating standardized reporting procedures that improved the flow of information between the capital and distant territories. These innovations seem mundane compared to the dramatic events that historians typically emphasize, but they represent the foundation upon which imperial power actually functioned. The palace workshops during Michael's reign buzzed with activity as craftsmen created the physical symbols of royal authority that reinforced the dynasty's legitimacy. Goldsmiths fashioned elaborate crowns and ceremonial objects that would be displayed during important state occasions, while textile workers created the rich fabrics that distinguished court dress from ordinary clothing. These artisans weren't simply creating luxury objects, but rather producing the visual vocabulary through which imperial power communicated with subjects who might never meet their ruler in person. Michael's evening meals often included conversations with scholars, monks, and foreign visitors who brought news and perspectives from beyond the palace walls. These informal discussions provided him with insights into how royal policies were being received throughout the empire and helped him understand the broader currents of religious, cultural, and economic change that were transforming Russian society. The transition from day to night in the Winter Palace revealed the careful security arrangements that protected the royal family while maintaining the accessibility that Russian traditions demanded of their rulers. Guards moved through corridors in patterns that had been refined over generations, while servants completed their daily tasks according to schedules that balanced efficiency with the ceremonial requirements of imperial protocol. As Michael aged and his son Alexis began assuming greater responsibilities, the palace became a training ground where the next generation of Romanov leadership learned to navigate the complexities of absolute rule in a rapidly changing world. The lessons taught within these walls would shape not only individual rulers but the entire trajectory of Russian history. As each successive Tsar built upon the foundations that Michael had established during those crucial early years of the dynasty. The death of Michael Romanov in 1645 marked not an ending but a transformation that would echo through the corridors of Russian power for generations. His son Alexis, now 26 and seasoned by years of careful preparation, inherited more than a crown. He inherited a vision of what Russia could become. Picture Alexis on the morning of his coronation, standing in the same chamber where his father had once trembled as a reluctant boy king. But where Michael had been overwhelmed by uncertainty, Alexis radiated quiet confidence. The early morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the intricate embroidery of his ceremonial robes. Each golden thread representing the accumulated wisdom and experience that had transformed the Romanov dynasty from desperate survivors into legitimate rulers. The coronation ceremony itself revealed how profoundly the imperial court had evolved under Michael's guidance. Where his father's crowning had been a hasty affair conducted amid national crisis, Alexis's elevation unfolded with elaborate precision that demonstrated Russia's renewed strength and prosperity. Foreign ambassadors filled the cathedral, their presence testament to the diplomatic relationships that had restored Russia's position among European powers. Alexis had spent his youth observing every aspect of his father's daily routine, absorbing lessons about leadership that went far beyond the formal instruction provided by tutors and advisors. He understood that ruling Russia required more than issuing commands from the throne room. It demanded an intimate knowledge of the rhythms and relationships that connected the palace to the remotest corners of the empire. His first months at Tsar established patterns that would define his entire reign. Each day began with extended prayers in the palace chapel where Alexis would spend nearly an hour in contemplation before facing the challenges of imperial administration. These morning devotions weren't merely ceremonial obligations, but essential preparation for the moral and spiritual demands of absolute rule over millions of subjects. The chapel where Alexis prayed each morning had been renovated during his father's reign. Its walls now covered with icons that told the story of Russian Orthodoxy's triumph over centuries of foreign domination and internal strife. The familiar faces of saints seemed to offer guidance as the young Tsar knelt before the altar, seeking wisdom for decisions that would affect generations yet unborn. After prayers came breakfast in the private royal apartments where Alexis maintained the informal family atmosphere that his parents had established despite the growing formality of court protocol. Palace servants noticed how the new Tsar insisted on eating with his wife and children whenever possible. Understanding that these moments of domestic normally provided essential balance to the isolation that surrounded imperial power. The morning meal typically included fresh bread from the palace bakeries accompanied by honey, preserved fruits, and dairy products from monastery farms that supplied the royal household. These seemingly simple foods represented complex networks of economic and religious relationships that connected the throne to Orthodox communities throughout the empire. Alexis understood that supporting monastic agriculture wasn't just about feeding the royal family, but about strengthening the spiritual institutions that provided moral authority for Romanov rule. The transition from family breakfast to official duties required Alexis to transform from husband and father into the embodiment of imperial authority. Palace attendants would help him change from comfortable morning clothes into the elaborate robes that marked his public appearances. Each garment carefully selected to convey appropriate messages about royal power and accessibility. The throne room where Alexis held court had been redesigned to reflect the dynasty's growing confidence and sophistication. Rich tapestries depicted scenes from Russian history, while carefully arranged furniture created spaces for different types of audiences with varying levels of formality. The throne itself had been elevated slightly higher than during his father's reign, a subtle change that reinforced the sacred nature of royal authority while maintaining the personal connection that Russians expected from their rulers. Morning audiences revealed the extraordinary diversity of people and problems that demanded imperial attention. Provincial governors would arrive with reports about local conditions. Their travel-stained clothes and exhausted faces testimony to the vast distances they had covered to reach the capital. Merchants would present petitions about trade regulations, while military commanders sought approval for campaigns against rebellious territories or foreign enemies. Alexis had developed remarkable skill at reading between the lines of official reports, understanding that what people chose not to say was often more important than their formal statements. A governor's silence about religious tensions might indicate brewing conflicts that required immediate attention, while a merchant's excessive praise for current policies could signal hidden opposition that needed careful management. The administrative work that consumed much of Alexis's morning hours involved reviewing documents that connected him to every corner of his vast empire. Reports from Siberian trading posts described encounters with indigenous peoples and Chinese merchants, while correspondence from western borders detailed ongoing tensions with Polish and Swedish forces. Each document required not just royal approval, but careful consideration of how local decisions might affect broader imperial interests. Palace scribes worked in shifts to maintain the constant flow of correspondence that kept the imperial administration functioning across thousands of miles of territory. These men possessed extraordinary knowledge of bureaucratic procedures and diplomatic protocols, serving as the invisible infrastructure that transformed royal decisions into practical policies affecting millions of subjects. Midday meals in the palace provided opportunities for Alexis to consult informally with advisors and courtiers whose insights helped him understand the complex currents of opinion that flowed through Russian society. These conversations took place in private dining rooms where the formal hierarchy of court protocol could be temporarily relaxed, allowing for more honest discussions about sensitive political and religious issues. The palace kitchens during Alexis's reign had evolved into sophisticated operations that served both practical and diplomatic purposes. Elaborate banquets for foreign visitors showcased Russian prosperity and cultural refinement. While the daily preparation of meals for the royal family and court required coordination between dozens of specialized workers whose skills had been passed down through generations of palace service. Afternoon hours were typically devoted to military planning and strategic consultations that addressed the constant security challenges facing the Russian Empire. Maps covered every available surface in the council chambers where Alexis met with generals and advisors. Their detailed markings showing troop movements, supply routes, and territorial boundaries that shifted constantly as Russia expanded its influence in all directions. These military discussions weren't abstract exercises in strategic theory, but urgent consultations about immediate threats and opportunities that demanded decisive action. Cossack uprisings in the south required different responses than Swedish raids in the north. While the ongoing expansion into Siberia created unique challenges that had no precedent in European warfare, Alexis demonstrated remarkable ability to balance competing military priorities with limited resources. Understanding that imperial expansion had to be carefully coordinated with diplomatic initiatives that prevented too many simultaneous conflicts. His approach to warfare reflected lessons learned from his father's reign when overextension had nearly destroyed the dynasty before it could establish secure foundations. The palace stables during this period housed hundreds of horses that served not just transportation needs but essential communication networks connecting the capital to distant territories. Royal messengers departed daily, carrying orders and correspondence that maintained imperial control over provinces separated by weeks or months of difficult travel. Evening routines in the palace revealed the more personal aspects of Alexis's character as he devoted time to family relationships and intellectual pursuits that balanced the demanding responsibilities of imperial rule. His private library had grown substantially since his father's death, reflecting his interest in history, theology, and the emerging scientific ideas that were transforming European thought. These evening hours often included musical performances and literary discussions that attracted scholars and artists from throughout the empire. Alexis understood that cultural patronage wasn't simply personal indulgence, but essential state craft that demonstrated Russian sophistication to foreign observers while encouraging domestic creativity that strengthened national identity. The palace workshops continued their production of ceremonial objects and luxury goods that reinforced the visual symbols of imperial authority. But under Alexis's patronage, these craftsmen also began experimenting with new techniques and designs that reflected Russia's growing contact with Western European artistic traditions. As night fell over St. Petersburg, the palace transformed into a quieter but no less active center of imperial administration. Night watches maintained security while allowing for the private meetings and confidential consultations that addressed the most sensitive aspects of Russian statecraft. These nocturnal hours often proved crucial for managing crises that required immediate attention despite the late hour. The bedchambers where Alexis and his family slept were designed not just for comfort and security, but as symbols of the domestic stability that the Romanov dynasty had brought to Russia after decades of chaos and uncertainty. The peaceful sleep of the royal family represented the broader peace that effective governance had restored to the empire. But even in sleep, the responsibilities of rule continued to shape royal life, as urgent messages could arrive at any hour, requiring immediate imperial attention. Palace protocols had been established to determine which emergencies justified waking the Tsar and which could wait until morning, reflecting the constant balance between accessibility and authority that defined effective royal leadership. Royal leadership. The rhythms of palace life during Alexis's reign reflected a careful balance between innovation and tradition that would define the Romanov approach to modernization for generations. Each morning brought new challenges that tested the young Tsar's ability to navigate between competing pressures from conservative boyars who feared change and progressive advisors who urged rapid adoption of Western practices. Alexis had inherited from his father a deep appreciation for the delicate art of compromise, understanding that successful reform required patience and strategic timing rather than dramatic pronouncements. In the council chambers where he met with his advisors each morning, maps of European kingdoms lay alongside traditional Russian chronicles, symbolizing the dual heritage that shaped his vision for the empire's future. The transformation of Russian military organization under Alexis represented perhaps his most significant contribution to the dynasty's long-term survival. Where previous rulers had relied primarily on irregular militia forces and foreign mercenaries, Alexis began the systematic development of professional military units, trained in modern European tactics while maintaining the fierce fighting spirit that had always characterized Russian warriors. Morning reviews of military reports revealed the extraordinary scope of this transformation. Training camps established throughout the empire were producing soldiers who could operate both traditional Russian weapons and the newer firearms that were revolutionizing European warfare. Officers educated in Moscow Mise brought technical knowledge that complemented the battlefield experience of veteran commanders who had learned their craft during the time of troubles. The palace armory during this period became a fascinating blend of old and new, where ancient ceremonial weapons were displayed alongside the latest military innovations imported from Germany and the Netherlands. Alexis would spend time each week examining these weapons personally, understanding that a ruler's knowledge of military technology was essential for making informed strategic decisions. Palace life during the afternoon hours often centered around the elaborate ceremonies that reinforced the sacred nature of imperial authority while accommodating the practical needs of modern administration. Foreign ambassadors arriving for audiences would first observe traditional Orthodox rituals that emphasized Russia's distinct religious identity, then participate in diplomatic discussions that demonstrated the empire's growing sophistication in European affairs. These diplomatic encounters required Alexis to master multiple roles simultaneously. Appearing as both the heir to ancient Russian traditions and a modern European monarch capable of negotiating complex international agreements, palace interpreters worked closely with the Tsar to ensure that subtle diplomatic language was properly understood and responded to, as misunderstandings could trigger conflicts that might involve multiple kingdoms. The evening banquets hosted for foreign visitors showcased the remarkable evolution of Russian court culture under Alexis's guidance. Traditional Russian dishes were prepared alongside French and Italian delicacies, while musical performances featured both Orthodox choral traditions and Western instrumental compositions. These cultural fusion events demonstrated Russia's ability to embrace foreign influences without abandoning its distinctive identity. Private family dinners provided essential counterbalance to the formal public ceremonies that consumed much of the royal schedule. Alexis insisted on maintaining regular meal times with his wife and children, understanding that these moments of domestic normalcy were crucial for preserving his psychological equilibrium amid the constant pressures of imperial rule. The royal children during this period received education that reflected their father's vision of Russia's future role in European affairs. Tutors included both Orthodox monks who taught traditional religious and cultural subjects and foreign scholars who provided instruction in languages, sciences, and diplomatic protocols that would be essential for future leadership responsibilities. Palace gardens established during Alexis's reign became outdoor classrooms where the royal family could escape the formal atmosphere of statedoms while maintaining the security necessary for imperial protection. These carefully designed landscapes featured both traditional Russian plantings and exotic species that demonstrated the empire's expanding trade connections with distant lands. The administrative innovations implemented during this period transformed the daily operations of imperial government in ways that would influence Russian bureaucracy for centuries. Standardized procedures for handling correspondence, managing provincial reports, and coordinating military operations created efficiency gains that allowed the central government to maintain effective control over increasingly vast territories. Palace libraries expanded dramatically under Alexis's patronage, accumulating not only religious texts and historical chronicles, but also technical manuals, scientific treatises, and foreign literature that reflected the Tsar's commitment to learning from international developments. These collections served both personal intellectual interests and practical governmental needs. As effective rule required understanding of subjects ranging from engineering to medicine, evening study sessions in the palace library became regular features of Alexis's routine, where he would review reports from provincial administrators while consulting historical precedents for similar challenges faced by previous rulers. These solitary hours of reflection allowed him to process the complex information gathered during daily audiences and develop comprehensive strategies for addressing long-term imperial objectives. The palace workshops during this period produced not only traditional ceremonial objects, but also practical innovations that improved administrative efficiency and military effectiveness. Craftsmen worked closely with foreign advisors to develop new techniques for metalwork, textile production, and precision manufacturing that enhanced Russia's technological capabilities. Night watches throughout the palace complex maintained security protocols that had been refined through decades of experience, managing the unique vulnerabilities associated with absolute rule. Guards rotated through carefully planned schedules that ensured continuous protection while allowing for the private meetings and confidential consultations that addressed the most sensitive aspects of imperial statecraft. The death of Alexis in 1676 created immediate succession challenges that tested every institutional strength the early Romanov rulers had built. His elder son, Feodor, inherited the throne at age 14, accompanied by the same mixture of uncertainty and hope that had marked previous royal transitions. Theodore's brief reign revealed both the resilience of Romanov governmental systems and the persistent vulnerabilities that absolute rule created during periods of weak leadership. Palace life adapted to accommodate a young ruler whose physical frailty required different approaches to the demanding schedule that had characterized his father's administration. Morning audiences during Theodore's reign were necessarily shortened and simplified as the young Tsar lacked both the experience and stamina required for the complex diplomatic negotiations that had filled his father's days. Regency councils assumed greater responsibilities for routine administrative decisions while preserving the ceremonial aspects of imperial authority that maintained public confidence in governmental stability. The palace medical staff gained unprecedented influence during this period as chronic health problems required constant attention that affected every aspect of royal scheduling and protocol. Court physicians trained in both traditional Russian healing methods and emerging European medical practices worked together to maintain the Tsar's health while managing the political implications of royal illness. Palace routines adjusted to accommodate Fyodor's limitations while maintaining the essential functions of imperial administration. Afternoon rest periods became mandatory elements of the royal schedule while evening activities were carefully planned to avoid overt taxing the young ruler's limited energy reserves. The religious dimensions of palace life intensified during Theodore's reign as the Tsar's personal piety and physical frailty combined to create an atmosphere of heightened spiritual devotion. Extended prayer services and religious ceremonies provided both personal comfort for the ailing ruler and public reassurance about divine support for the Romanov dynasty. Family relationships within the palace became increasingly complex as various relatives and advisors competed for influence over the impressionable young Tsar. Sofia Alexeyevna, Theodore's half-sister, emerged as a particularly significant figure whose intelligence and political acumen gradually positioned her as the effective power behind the throne. The administrative challenges created by Theodore's weakness revealed the importance of institutional structures that could maintain governmental continuity regardless of individual royal capabilities. Palace bureaucracies that had been established during previous reigns proved essential for preserving policy coherence while accommodating the practical limitations imposed by ineffective leadership. Military affairs during this period required especially careful management as foreign powers constantly probed for signs of weakness that might provide opportunities for territorial expansion or diplomatic advantage. Palace war councils worked to maintain the appearance of imperial strength while avoiding conflicts that might overwhelm the empire's reduced capacity for effective military leadership. The brief nature of Theodore's reign created unique pressures regarding succession planning as the absence of direct heirs raised questions about dynastic continuity that had been largely resolved during previous generations. Palace discussions about potential successors became increasingly urgent as the young Khazar's health continued to deteriorate. The death of Fyodor in 1682 precipitated the most serious succession crisis the Romanov dynasty had yet faced as competing claims from different family branches threatened to revive the political chaos that had nearly destroyed Russia before Michael's coronation. The palace became the center of intense negotiations between various factions seeking to control the imperial succession. The eventual resolution of this crisis through the unprecedented arrangement of dual Tsars, even the fifth and Peter I, reflected both the flexibility of Romanov institutional structures and the continuing challenges inherent in absolute rule during periods of uncertain leadership. Palace life adapted once again to accommodate shared authority while preserving the essential elements of imperial continuity. These early succession struggles established precedents and revealed vulnerabilities that would influence Romanov dynastic politics for the remainder of the imperial period. The lessons learned during these turbulent years about the relationship between personal rule and institutional stability would prove crucial as the dynasty faced even greater challenges in the centuries ahead. The palace workshops, libraries, and administrative offices that had been developed during the reigns of Michael, Alexis, and Theodore provided the institutional foundation that allowed the Romanov dynasty to survive these early crises while maintaining effective governance over the vast Russian Empire. The quiet daily routines established in these palace chambers would continue to shape imperial administration long after the individual rulers who created them had passed into history. The emergence of Peter I as the dominant ruler marked a revolutionary transformation that would echo through every corner of the Russian Empire. Picture a 17-year-old giant of a man striding through the palace corridors at dawn. His footsteps so forceful that servants could hear him approaching from 3 rooms away. Where previous czars had moved with ceremonial dignity, Peter charged through his daily routine with an energy that seemed to electrify everyone around him. His morning rituals broke centuries of imperial tradition in ways that shocked conservative courtiers and thrilled progressive observers. Instead of beginning each day with extended prayers in the palace chapel, Peter would often start by visiting the workshops he had established in the palace basement where foreign craftsmen taught Russian apprentices the latest techniques in metalwork, carpentry, and mechanical engineering. The sound of hammers on anvils and the smell of hot metal became familiar features of early morning palace life as Peter worked alongside common laborers. His hands growing calloused from actual manual work that no previous Russian ruler had ever performed. Palace servants would find him covered in soot and sawdust, examining intricate clockwork mechanisms or discussing mathematical principles with Dutch engineers who had traveled thousands of miles to share their knowledge. These workshop sessions weren't mere curiosities or royal hobbies, but essential elements of Peter's vision for transforming Russia into a modern European power. Every technique mastered in the palace workshops would eventually be applied on a massive scale throughout the empire. As Peter understood that technological advancement required hands-on knowledge rather than theoretical understanding, breakfast during Peter's reign became working meals where foreign advisors, military engineers, and scientific experts gathered around tables covered with architectural plans, naval designs, and administrative reforms. The young Tsar would consume simple bread and ale while simultaneously reviewing reports from provincial governors and sketching improvements to fortress designs. His mind constantly moving between immediate practical problems and long-term strategic objectives. The palace dining halls buzzed with conversations in multiple languages as Peter insisted on conducting business in whatever tongue best served the immediate purpose. German military advisors discussed artillery innovations while Dutch shipbuilders explained hull construction techniques and Scottish mercenaries shared insights about infantry tactics. All while Russian courtiers struggled to adapt to this polyglot environment that challenged every assumption about proper imperial protocol. Morning audiences during Peter's reign transformed from formal ceremonies into intensive working sessions where practical problems received immediate attention rather than diplomatic consideration. Provincial governors arriving with reports about local conditions found themselves interrogated with the thoroughness of military debriefings as Peter demanded detailed information about everything from crop yields to road conditions to the availability of skilled craftsmen in remote territories. The throne room itself was redesigned to accommodate Peter's hands-on approach to governance with works replacing ornamental furniture and technical drawings covering walls that had previously displayed religious icons. Foreign visitors were amazed to find the Russian emperor examining mechanical devices or reviewing engineering calculations during official audiences. His attention focused on practical solutions rather than ceremonial displays of imperial majesty. Palace scribes worked overtime to document the flood of innovations and reforms that poured from Peter's restless mind. Their careful handwriting recording everything from new military regulations to detailed specifications for industrial equipment. These administrative records reveal the extraordinary scope of transformation that Peter envisioned for his empire, encompassing not just governmental procedures but fundamental changes in how Russians approach work, education, and social relationships. The afternoon hours brought military training sessions that Peter conducted personally in palace courtyards where he drilled alongside common soldiers to understand firsthand the practical challenges of implementing new tactical innovations. Palace guards accustomed to ceremonial duties found themselves learning European military formations while their Tsar corrected their posture and explained the mathematical principles underlying effective artillery deployment. These training sessions extended beyond military applications to include civilian skills that Peter considered essential for national development. Palace servants were taught basic literacy and numerical calculations, while craftsmen received instruction in technical drawing and precision measurement techniques that would improve the quality of their work and enable more sophisticated manufacturing processes. Palace kitchens during this period adapted to serve not just the royal family, but the growing community of foreign experts who lived and worked within the imperial complex. Cooks learned to prepare dishes from across Europe while maintaining Russian culinary traditions, creating fusion menus that reflected the cultural integration Peter was promoting throughout his empire. Evening meals became international symposiums where ideas flowed as freely as wine, with Peter encouraging debates between representatives of different national traditions and professional specializations. These dinner conversations often continued late into the night as participants discussed everything from ship design to educational philosophy, their animated discussions providing Peter with insights that influenced policy decisions affecting millions of subjects. The palace library expanded dramatically to include technical manuals, scientific treatises, and foreign literature that supported Peter's educational initiatives. Evening study sessions found the SAR poring over navigational charts and engineering texts, his marginalia revealing a mind that approached learning with the same intensity he brought to physical labor and military training. Palace workshops operated around the clock to produce the tools, weapons, and equipment necessary for Peter's ambitious modernization projects. The sounds of construction and manufacturing became constant features of palace life as craftsmen worked to meet demand for everything from precision instruments to industrial machinery, their innovations serving as prototypes for technologies that would transform Russian manufacturing capabilities. Night watches during Peter's reign maintained security while accommodating the irregular schedules that resulted from his boundless energy and international focus. Guards learned to expect late-night arrivals of foreign dignitaries and technical experts, while palace staff adapted to supporting work sessions that might continue until dawn when particularly complex problems demanded immediate solutions. The transformation of palace life during these years reflected broader changes that Peter was implementing throughout Russian society. Traditional hierarchies based on birth and ceremony gave way to merit-based advancement systems that rewarded practical skills and innovative thinking. Palace servants found themselves promoted based on their ability to master new technologies rather than their knowledge of court protocol. While foreign experts were integrated into Russian society with unprecedented speed and success, family relationships within the palace became increasingly complex as Peter's sisters and traditional courtiers struggled to adapt to the revolutionary changes in imperial culture. Sofia Alexieva, who had wielded significant influence during previous reigns, found her authority challenged by Peter's preference for technical expertise over political manipulation, leading to tensions that would eventually result in her complete removal from palace influence. The daily rhythms of palace life accelerated to match Peter's relentless pace, with morning meetings beginning earlier and evening sessions extending later as the young Tsar compressed more activities into each day than seemed humanly possible. Palace staff learned to anticipate sudden changes in schedule as urgent projects demanded immediate attention or unexpected opportunities required rapid response. Administrative procedures streamlined to support Peter's preference for direct action over lengthy deliberation, with decision-making processes that had traditionally required weeks of consultation now completed within days or even hours when circumstances demanded immediate response. Palace bureaucracies adapted to maintain detailed records while accommodating the rapid pace of policy implementation that characterized Peter's revolutionary approach to governance. The international character of palace life intensified as Peter recruited experts from across Europe to support his modernization initiatives. Diplomatic receptions became technical conferences where foreign specialists shared knowledge while negotiating agreements that combined traditional diplomatic objectives with practical collaboration on scientific and industrial projects. Cultural activities within the palace reflected Peter's determination to integrate Russian traditions with European innovations, creating new forms of entertainment that combined orthodox religious elements with secular artistic expressions borrowed from Western courts. Musical performances featured both traditional Russian folk songs and sophisticated European compositions, while theatrical presentations explored themes that bridged ancient Russian stories with contemporary political and social issues. Palace gardens were redesigned to serve both aesthetic and practical purposes, with formal landscaping that demonstrated European artistic principles while incorporating experimental agricultural techniques that could be applied throughout the empire. These outdoor spaces became laboratories where new crops and cultivation methods were tested before being introduced to Russian farmers who had relied on traditional practices for centuries. The medical facilities within the palace expanded to include both traditional Russian healing methods and modern European medical practices, reflecting Peter's practical approach to adopting whatever techniques proved most effective, regardless of their cultural origins. Palace physicians trained in anatomy and surgical procedures that had been previously unknown in Russia, while maintaining respect for herbal remedies and spiritual healing traditions that remained popular among the general population. Religious observances within the palace adapted to accommodate Peter's reforms while preserving the orthodox foundations that provided spiritual legitimacy for Romanov rule. Morning prayers were shortened and simplified to allow time for other activities. Livestock. Stable management became a technical discipline requiring knowledge of animal husbandry, nutrition, and medical care that paralleled the scientific approaches being applied throughout the imperial administration. While religious festivals incorporated new elements that reflected Russia's growing international connections and cultural sophistication, the palace stables expanded to house not only horses for transportation and ceremony, but also the specialized animals required for Peter's various projects, including draft horses for construction work and breeding stock for improving Russian livestock. Stable management became a technical discipline requiring knowledge of animal husbandry, nutrition, and medical care that paralleled the scientific approaches being applied throughout the imperial administration. Storage facilities throughout the palace complex grew to accommodate the vast quantities of materials required for Peter's construction projects and military preparations. Warehouses contained everything from architectural supplies to scientific instruments. Their careful organization reflecting the systematic approach that characterized all aspects of the reformed imperial administration. Communication systems connecting the palace to distant territories improved dramatically as Peter established regular courier services and developed new methods for transmitting complex technical information across vast distances. These innovations reduced the time required for implementing central government decisions while improving the quality of information available for policy planning and strategic assessment. The transformation of palace life during Peter's early reign established patterns that would influence Russian imperial culture for the remainder of the Romanov dynasty. The integration of practical work with ceremonial authority, the emphasis on technical education alongside traditional learning, and the systematic adoption of foreign innovations while preserving Russian identity created a template for modernization that balanced revolutionary change with institutional continuity. As Peter's reign progressed and his vision for Russia's transformation became increasingly ambitious, palace life would continue evolving to support projects that would astonish the world and establish Russia as a major European power. The daily routines established within these palace walls during the 1680s and 1690s provided the foundation for achievements that would reshape not only Russian society but the entire balance of power among European nations. The young Tsar, who had shocked conservative courtiers by working with his hands in palace workshops, was preparing to shock the world by building a new capital city from scratch, creating a modern navy from nothing, and transforming an isolated medieval kingdom into an empire that would command respect from the most sophisticated courts of Europe. The revolution that began in the palace workshops would soon extend to every corner of the vast Russian territories, carried forward by the boundless energy and visionary determination of a ruler who refused to accept limitations that had constrained his predecessors for centuries. The construction of St. Petersburg began in 1703 with a vision so audacious that even Peter's closest advisors questioned his sanity. Imagine standing in the marshy wasteland of the Neva Delta on a fog-shrouded morning, watching thousands of workers arrive with nothing but primitive tools and an imperial command to build a city where none had ever existed. The morning mist clung to the boggy ground as Peter himself waded through knee-deep mud, gesturing enthusiastically at empty spaces where he envisioned grand palaces and broad avenues that would rival anything in Europe. The daily routine of building this impossible city began before dawn when Peter would emerge from his simple wooden cabin wearing the same rough workclothes as his laborers. Palace life, as it had been known for generations, temporarily ceased to exist as the Tsar lived like a common foreman, sharing meals of blackbur and saltfish while sketching architectural plans by candlelight. The sound of axes biting into timber and shovels scraping against frozen earth became the new music of imperial power, replacing the gentle chants and ceremonial bells that had marked previous royal mornings. Peter's breakfast during these early construction years consisted of whatever food could be prepared over open fires in the work camps, eaten while standing knee-deep in construction debris as he explained engineering principles to bewildered Russian peasants who had never seen anything more complex than a village church. Foreign architects and engineers would arrive each morning to find their imperial patron already covered in mud and sawdust, examining foundation work with the intensity of a master craftsman rather than a crowned ruler. The transformation of imperial routine during St. Petersburg's construction reveals the extraordinary personal commitment Peter brought to his vision of modernizing Russia. Morning conferences were held on scaffolding platforms overlooking construction sites where Italian architects discussed Baroque design principles while Swedish military engineers explained fortress construction techniques. All while Peter balanced on wooden planks 40 feet above the marshy ground. Palace protocols adapted to accommodate construction schedules that operated regardless of weather, season, or traditional court ceremonies. Imperial audiences were conducted in half-finished buildings where the smell of fresh mortar mingled with diplomatic perfumes as foreign ambassadors picked their way across construction sites to meet with a tar whose hands were perpetually stained with builder's lime and carpenter's glue. The daily challenges of creating a city from nothing required Peter to master skills that no previous Russian ruler had ever needed. Morning inspections included detailed examinations of brick quality, timber seasoning, and foundation drainage. As Peter learned to distinguish between competent craftsmanship and shoddy work that could undermine entire buildings, his conversations with master builders became technical discussions about soil composition, structural engineering, and architectural proportions that would have been incomprehensible to his predecessors. Lunch during the construction period was served on makeshift tables surrounded by the controlled chaos of urban development, where Peter would review progress reports while simultaneously sketching improvements to street layouts and building designs. The constant noise of hammering, sawing, and shouting created a work environment that bore no resemblance to the quiet dignity of traditional palace life, yet somehow enhanced Peter's ability to think clearly about complex logistical problems. The international character of St. Petersburg's construction brought together craftsmen from across Europe, creating a polyglot work environment where communication required constant translation between Russian, German, Dutch, Italian, and Swedish languages. Peter served as interpreter and coordinator. His growing fluency in multiple languages, enabling him to bridge cultural differences while maintaining focus on practical construction objectives. Afternoon work sessions found Peter climbing through partially completed buildings, examining everything from window installations to roof construction techniques with the thoroughness of a professional inspector. Craftsmen produced the decorative elements and precision components required for Peter's architectural vision. His understanding of architectural details improved daily as he learned from master craftsmen who taught him to evaluate structural integrity, aesthetic proportions, and practical functionality with increasingly sophisticated judgment. The palace workshops that had been established in Moscow were recreated in temporary buildings throughout the construction site, where specialized craftsmen produced the decorative elements and precision components required for Peter's architectural vision. These workshops operated in conditions that would have horrified traditional court officials, with valuable materials stored in drafty sheds and delicate work performed despite constant interruption from construction activities. Evening meals during the construction years were communal affairs shared with workers from dozens of different countries. Their animated conversations providing Peter with insights into construction techniques and cultural practices that influenced his evolving vision for the new capital. These informal dining sessions often continued late into the night as participants discussed everything from urban planning to international trade. Their collective expertise helping Peter understand the complex relationships between architecture, commerce, and political power. The religious dimensions of daily life adapted to accommodate construction schedules that left little time for elaborate ceremonies. Morning prayers were brief and practical, often conducted outdoors among construction materials, while Peter sought divine blessing for the day's building activities. Orthodox priests learned to minister to workers who labored in dangerous conditions, providing spiritual comfort while adapting traditional rituals to the realities of massive construction projects. Night watches during the construction period maintained security while protecting valuable materials and equipment from theft or sabotage. Guards patrolled between stacks of imported marble and precision tools. Their vigilance essential for maintaining construction schedules that depended on irreplaceable materials transported vast distances at enormous expense. The gradual completion of the first permanent buildings allowed for the restoration of more formal court life, but with innovations that reflected Peter's experiences during the construction period. Palace routines incorporated regular site inspections and construction meetings into ceremonial schedules, creating new traditions that combined imperial dignity with hands-on involvement in practical governance. Family relationships within the emerging palace complex were shaped by the shared experience of creating something unprecedented in Russian history. Peter's wife and children adapted to living in partially completed buildings while participating in the collective effort required to establish a functioning capital city in what had been uninhabitable swampland just years before. The completion of the Winter Palace in 1711 marked the beginning of a new era in Russian imperial life, where European architectural grandeur was combined with the practical innovations that Peter had developed during the construction period. Palace life evolved to accommodate both traditional ceremonial requirements and the ongoing demands of governing an empire that was simultaneously expanding its territories and modernizing its internal systems. Morning routines in the completed Winter Palace retained elements of the construction period's informality while restoring appropriate imperial dignity. Peter's daily schedule began with technical consultations that addressed everything from naval construction to industrial development. His conversations with advisors reflecting the comprehensive understanding of practical governance that he had gained through direct involvement in building his new capital. Administrative offices within the Winter Palace were designed to support the expanded governmental activities that St. Petersburg's construction had made necessary. Departments responsible for urban planning, public works, and international trade operated alongside traditional ministries. Their activities coordinated through new bureaucratic procedures that reflected Peter's systematic approach to imperial administration. The palace workshops continued operating as centers of innovation where Russian craftsmen worked alongside foreign experts to develop new techniques and produce sophisticated goods that demonstrated the empire's growing industrial capabilities. These facilities served both practical production needs and symbolic purposes, showcasing Russian technological advancement to visiting dignitaries who were amazed by the transformation that Peter had accomplished. Cultural activities within the Winter Palace reflected the international character that St. Petersburg's construction had brought to Russian court life. Musical performances featured compositions from across Europe, while theatrical presentations explored themes that celebrated both Russian traditions and contemporary achievements in architecture, engineering, and military affairs. Diplomatic receptions in the completed palace provided opportunities to demonstrate the success of Peter's modernization efforts while maintaining the ceremonial grandeur that impressed foreign visitors. The architectural magnificence of the palace rooms provided appropriate settings for negotiations that established Russia's position as a major European power worthy of respect and alliance. The daily rhythms of palace life in St. Petersburg established patterns that would influence Russian imperial culture throughout the remaining centuries of Romanov rule. The combination of European sophistication with Russian character, the integration of practical governance with ceremonial authority, and the emphasis on innovation alongside tradition created a distinctive imperial style that reflected Peter's revolutionary vision. Educational activities within the palace expanded to include technical training alongside traditional academic subjects, reflecting Peter's belief that effective leadership required practical knowledge as well as theoretical understanding. The royal children and court officials received instruction in mathematics, engineering, and foreign languages that prepared them for the complex challenges of governing a modernizing empire. Medical facilities in the Winter Palace incorporated both traditional Russian healing practices and modern European medical techniques, providing health care that reflected the cultural integration that characterized all aspects of Peter's reforms. Palace physicians trained in anatomy and surgical procedures while maintaining respect for herbal remedies and spiritual healing traditions that remained important to many Russians. The palace libraries accumulated technical manuals and scientific treatises alongside historical chronicles and religious texts, creating research facilities that supported both governmental decision and ongoing educational initiatives. These collections served scholars and officials who needed current information about everything from military technology to agricultural innovation. Storage facilities throughout the palace complex were organized to support the various governmental and cultural activities that St. Petersburg's role as the new capital required. Warehouses contained everything from diplomatic gifts to industrial prototypes, their systematic organization reflecting the administrative efficiency that Peter had developed during the construction period. Communication systems connecting the Winter Palace to other parts of the empire improved dramatically as St. Petersburg's development created new transportation networks and administrative procedures. Regular courier services and standardized reporting systems reduced the time required for implementing central government policies while improving the quality of information available for strategic planning. The establishment of St. Petersburg as Russia's capital represented more than just the construction of impressive buildings and creation of efficient governmental systems. It symbolized the fundamental transformation of Russian society under Peter's leadership, demonstrating that traditional limitations could be overcome through determined effort, international cooperation, and systematic application of practical knowledge. The palace life that emerged in St. Petersburg during the early 18th century provided the foundation for achievements that would astonish Europe and establish Russia as a major world power. The daily routines established within the Winter Palace walls reflected Peter's vision of modernized imperial governance that combined the best elements of European civilization with distinctive Russian character and traditions. As Peter's reign continued and his reforms extended throughout Russian society, the palace would serve as both the symbol of imperial authority and the practical center of governmental innovation. The morning workshops and evening conferences, the international diplomatic receptions and technical planning sessions, the ceremonial grandeur and hands-on problem-solving, all became integral elements of a new style of imperial leadership that would influence Russian history for generations to come. The Tsar, who had personally wielded hammers and saws during St. Petersburg's construction, had created more than just a magnificent capital city. He had established new patterns of royal authority that emphasized practical achievement alongside ceremonial dignity, international cooperation combined with national pride, and innovative thinking balanced with respect for valuable traditions. The revolution that had begun in palace workshops had transformed not only Russian government but Russian society itself, creating foundations for an empire that would command respect throughout the world. empire that would command respect throughout the world. The military victories that followed St. Petersburg's completion transformed the palace from a construction headquarters into the command center of a growing empire. Picture Peter in his private study at 4 in the morning, bent over maps that stretched across 3 tables, their edges weighted down with brass instruments and half-empty tea glasses. The candle light flickered across charts showing the Baltic coastline where Swedish fortresses had stood for centuries. Their positions now marked with red ink, indicating Russian conquests that had seemed impossible just decades before. His morning routine during the Great Northern War began with dispatches that arrived throughout the night from commanders scattered across thousands of miles of active front lines. Palace couriers would slip quietly into the study, leaving leather pouches filled with reports that Peter would read by lamplight while making notes in the margins with a goose quill that had become permanently stained with red ink. The smell of sealing wax and parchment filled the early morning air as he crafted responses that would determine the movements of entire armies. Breakfast during these war years was consumed while reviewing intelligence reports about Swedish troop movements and Danish naval activities. Peter had learned to eat quickly with one hand while sketching tactical diagrams with the other. His mind constantly processing information about supply lines, weather conditions, and the morale of forces operating in hostile territory. Palace servants would find him surrounded by crumbs and coffee stains, completely absorbed in calculations that balanced military objectives against logistical constraints. The war room adjacent to Peter's study buzzed with activity as foreign military advisors arrived each morning to participate in strategic planning sessions that combined European tactical knowledge with Russian understanding of local conditions. German artillery experts would explain the mathematics of cannon placement, while Scottish infantry commanders shared insights about training methods that could improve the effectiveness of Russian foot soldiers. These morning conferences revealed the extraordinary complexity of coordinating military operations across the vast distances that characterized Russian warfare. Communications with field commanders required weeks to travel between the capital and active combat zones, forcing Peter to anticipate problems and opportunities that might not become apparent until long after his orders had been dispatched. Palace scribes worked in shifts to maintain correspondence with dozens of different commanders, their careful handwriting recording everything from ammunition requests to casualty reports. The palace armory expanded dramatically during the war years to serve as both a storage facility and a testing ground for new weapons technologies. Peter would spend time each morning examining captured Swedish equipment and comparing it to Russian-manufactured weapons. His growing expertise in military engineering enabling him to identify improvements that could provide tactical advantages on future battlefields. Morning inspections of the armory revealed Peter's hands-on approach to military innovation, as he would personally test the weight and balance of different weapons while discussing metallurgy and gunpowder composition with master craftsmen. These sessions often extended well into the afternoon as Peter experimented with modifications to existing designs and evaluated prototypes of entirely new weapon systems. The international character of the war effort brought together military experts from across Europe who had been recruited to serve in Russian forces. Palace dining rooms accommodated officers from Prussia, Scotland, the Netherlands, and various German states. Their animated discussions during meals, providing Peter with insights into different national approaches to military organization and tactical innovation. Lunch during the war years became working sessions where battlefield reports were analyzed and future operations planned. Peter would spread maps across dining tables while consuming simple meals of bread and meat. His attention focused on understanding the strategic implications of recent victories and defeats. These informal planning sessions often produced decisions that affected the deployment of thousands of soldiers and the expenditure of enormous resources. The palace workshops adapted to support military production requirements with craftsmen working around the clock to produce specialized equipment and ammunition for Russian forces. The sounds of metalwork and woodworking filled the palace complex as artisans created everything from artillery pieces to surgical instruments. Their innovations contributing to the technological superiority that gave Russian forces advantages over traditional European armies. Afternoon training sessions in palace courtyards allowed Peter to personally evaluate new tactical formations and training methods before implementing them throughout Russian military units. Foreign drill instructors would demonstrate European military techniques while Peter observed and questioned every detail. His understanding of practical combat requirements, enabling him to adapt foreign methods to Russian conditions and capabilities. The palace stables during wartime housed not only ceremonial horses, but also the specialized animals required for military communications and logistics support. Courier horses were maintained in peak condition to ensure rapid transmission of orders and intelligence, while draft animals were trained for the demanding work of moving artillery and supplies across difficult terrain. Evening reports from the front lines arrived through an elaborate network of relay stations that Peter had established to maintain communication with his scattered forces. Palace staff would sort through dispatches and prepare summaries that allowed the Tsar to quickly understand the current status of multiple simultaneous campaigns. His evening review sessions determining priorities for the following day's activities. The medical facilities within the palace expanded to accommodate wounded officers who were brought back to the capital for treatment that was unavailable in field hospitals. Palace physicians developed new surgical techniques while treating injuries that resulted from the increasingly sophisticated weapons being used in contemporary warfare. Their innovations improving survival rates while providing valuable information about the medical requirements of modern military operations. Night watches during the war years maintained heightened security while accommodating the irregular schedules that resulted from urgent military communications. Guards learned to expect late-night arrivals of courier messengers and emergency consultations that might continue until dawn when particularly critical situations demanded immediate imperial attention and response. Religious observances within the palace adapted to accommodate the spiritual needs of a nation at war with special prayers for military success and thanksgiving ceremonies for significant victories. Orthodox priests ministered to soldiers departing for combat while providing comfort to families whose loved ones served in distant campaigns. Their spiritual guidance helping maintain morale during the extended conflicts that characterized Peter's military campaigns. The palace libraries accumulated military treatises and strategic analyses alongside technical manuals and historical accounts of previous wars. Evening study sessions found Peter examining classical texts about military leadership while reviewing contemporary reports about European tactical innovations. His scholarly approach to warfare contributing to the systematic improvements that made Russian forces increasingly effective. Cultural activities within the palace reflected the patriotic enthusiasm that military victories generated throughout Russian society. Musical performances celebrated recent conquests while theatrical presentations explored themes of national pride and military heroism. Their artistic expressions reinforcing public support for the continuing war effort while providing entertainment that boosted morale during difficult periods. Diplomatic receptions during wartime served dual purposes as social occasions and intelligence-gathering opportunities where foreign ambassadors might inadvertently reveal information about their government's military preparations and strategic intentions. Peter became extraordinarily skilled at extracting useful intelligence through casual conversation while maintaining the diplomatic courtesies that preserved international relationships. The administrative challenges of coordinating military campaigns while maintaining domestic governance required Peter to develop new governmental procedures that could function effectively despite his frequent absences from the capital. Palace bureaucracies adapted to support decision-making processes that might be interrupted by urgent military requirements while preserving continuity in routine administrative functions. Family life within the palace was inevitably affected by the demands of military leadership as Peter's attention was constantly divided between domestic responsibilities and strategic planning. Palace routines accommodated irregular schedules while maintaining the ceremonial obligations that reinforced imperial authority and provided stability for court officials and foreign observers. The financial requirements of sustained military campaigns transformed palace economic management as enormous resources were required to maintain armies in the field while supporting the domestic economy that provided the foundation for continued military success. Palace treasurers worked closely with military quartermasters to ensure adequate funding for operations while managing the complex logistics of moving money and supplies across vast distances. Storage facilities throughout the palace complex expanded to accommodate military supplies and captured equipment that demonstrated Russian victories while providing materials for ongoing operations. Warehouses contained everything from Swedish artillery pieces to Danish naval equipment. Their content serving both practical military needs and symbolic purposes that reinforced public confidence in Russian military superiority. Communication improvements developed during the war years enhanced governmental efficiency while providing military advantages that contributed to Russian success in campaigns against more traditionally organized European armies. The courier networks and administrative procedures that Peter established for military purposes proved equally valuable for domestic governance and economic development. The victory at Pava in 1709 marked the decisive turning point that established Russia as a major European power while transforming palace life from wartime emergency management to imperial celebration and long-term strategic planning. The battle reports that arrived in St. Petersburg described the complete destruction of Swedish military power and the capture of thousands of enemy soldiers, their accounts triggering celebrations that lasted for weeks. Peter's personal reaction to the Pava victory revealed both his strategic understanding and his genuine surprise at the completeness of Russian success. Palace witnesses described him reading the initial battle reports with growing amazement, then calling for maps to understand the broader implications of Swedish defeat for European balance of power and Russian expansion opportunities. The celebration preparations that followed the Pava victory transformed the Winter Palace into a festival center where foreign diplomats, military officers, and court officials gathered to honor Russian achievements while negotiating the complex diplomatic arrangements that would formalize territorial gains and establish new international relationships. Victory banquets featured elaborate displays of captured Swedish military equipment alongside traditional Russian foods and imported European delicacies. Their symbolic presentations demonstrating the fusion of military success with cultural sophistication that characterized Peter's vision of modernized imperial power. The long-term implications of military victory extended far beyond immediate territorial gains to include fundamental changes in European diplomatic relationships and economic opportunities that would influence Russian development for generations. Palace planning sessions during the months following Pava focused on consolidating military achievements while establishing governmental systems that could effectively administer newly acquired territories. The transformation of Russia from a peripheral kingdom into a major European empire required Peter to develop new approaches to international relations that balanced military strength with diplomatic sophistication. Palace protocols evolved to accommodate the enhanced status that military victory had brought to Russian imperial authority while maintaining the practical efficiency that had enabled previous successes. As the Great Northern War continued toward its eventual conclusion with the Treaty of Nisad in 1721, Palace life reflected the growing confidence and international recognition that Russian military achievements had earned. The daily routines established during years of intense warfare provided foundations for governing an empire that had expanded dramatically while modernizing its internal systems and international relationships. The Tsar, who had personally planned military campaigns from his palace study, had created more than just territorial expansion and military victory. He had established Russia's position among European great powers while developing governmental systems that could effectively administer a vast diverse empire spanning multiple continents and cultures. The morning strategy sessions and evening victory celebrations, the international diplomatic receptions and domestic administrative innovations had all contributed to achievements that would influence world history for centuries to come. The decades following the Great Northern War saw palace life settle into rhythms that balanced Peter's revolutionary innovations with the ceremonial traditions that gave legitimacy to imperial power. Picture the Winter Palace on a crisp February morning in 1715, where the young Tsarevich Alexis moved through corridors that still echoed with the sounds of his father's relentless activity. The contrast between father and son became apparent in every aspect of their daily routines. As Alexis preferred the quiet contemplation of religious texts over the mechanical drawings and military dispatches that consumed Peter's attention, morning prayers in the palace chapel revealed the growing tension between traditional Orthodox spirituality and Peter's westernizing reforms. Alexis would kneel for extended periods before ancient icons, his devotions lasting far longer than his father considered necessary or appropriate. The young man's genuine piety attracted conservative courtiers who saw in him a potential return to older Russian values, while Peter viewed his son's religious intensity as evidence of dangerous resistance to necessary modernization. Breakfast conversations between father and son became increasingly strained as Peter attempted to interest Alexis in the technical subjects that he considered essential for future leadership. The Tsar would arrive at the family dining table carrying architectural plans or artillery manuals. His enthusiasm for engineering problems meeting only polite disinterest from a son whose mind was occupied with theological questions and historical chronicles about ancient Russian saints. The palace tutors found themselves caught between competing visions of appropriate education for the heir to the throne. Peter insisted on lessons in mathematics, modern languages, and military science, while Alexis gravitated toward church Slavonic texts and philosophical discussions about the proper relationship between earthly authority and divine will. These educational conflicts reflected broader tensions within Russian society about the direction of imperial development. Administrative meetings during this period revealed Peter's growing frustration with what he perceived as his son's inability to grasp the practical requirements of modern governance. The Tsar would explain complex policies about military recruitment or economic development, only to discover that Alexis was more concerned with the moral implications of these policies than with their practical implementation and effectiveness. The palace workshops that had been centers of innovation during the construction years gradually became sources of conflict as Peter attempted to interest his son in the mechanical skills that he considered fundamental to effective leadership. Alexis would dutifully observe demonstrations of new technologies. But his obvious lack of enthusiasm disappointed a father who had hoped to pass on his passion for hands-on problem-solving. Afternoon training sessions in palace courtyards highlighted the fundamental differences in temperament and ability between Peter and his heir. Whether Tsar had excelled in physical challenges and enjoyed the competitive aspects of military exercises, Alexis struggled with activities that required strength, coordination, and aggressive instincts that seemed foreign to his contemplative nature. Evening family gatherings became increasingly uncomfortable as Peter's second wife, Catherine, attempted to mediate between a husband whose patience was wearing thin and a stepson whose resentment was growing more obvious. The dining room conversations that had once featured animated discussions about imperial projects now proceeded with formal politeness that barely concealed mutual disappointment and misunderstanding. The palace library became Alexis's refuge during these difficult years where he could escape the pressures of imperial expectations by immersing himself in historical accounts of previous Russian rulers who had governed according to traditional Orthodox principles. His marginalia in these books revealed a young man searching for alternative models of leadership that might reconcile his personal convictions with his inherited responsibilities. Religious advisors who gained influence with Alexis during this period represented conservative factions that opposed many of Peter's reforms, viewing them as dangerous departures from Russian tradition that threatened both spiritual and political stability. These priests and monks encouraged the Tsarevich's doubts about his father's policies while offering theological justification for resistance to changes that seemed to prioritize foreign ideas over orthodox wisdom. The international visitors who frequented the palace during these years provided contrasting perspectives on the succession question that was becoming increasingly urgent as Peter aged and Alexis remained reluctant to embrace his father's vision for Russia's future. Foreign diplomats reported home about the obvious tensions within the imperial family. Their observations influencing European assessments of Russian political stability and long-term strategic reliability. Palace servants observed the daily interactions between father and son with growing concern, understanding that the unresolved conflicts between different approaches to imperial leadership could eventually threaten the stability that the Romanov dynasty had worked so hard to establish. The morning arguments and evening silences created an atmosphere of unease that affected everyone who lived and worked within the palace complex. Cultural activities within the palace reflected these underlying tensions as Peter promoted European artistic traditions while Alexis patronized Russian religious art and traditional musical forms. The competing cultural programs created divided loyalties among court officials who had to navigate between supporting the current Tsar's preferences and maintaining relationships with his potential successor. Medical consultations during this period increasingly focused on Peter's health problems, which were exacerbated by decades of physical exertion and the psychological stress of governing an empire while managing family conflicts that threatened dynastic continuity. Palace physicians found themselves treating both physical ailments and the emotional exhaustion that resulted from unresolved succession tensions. The palace workshops continued producing innovations and luxury goods, but their activities were increasingly overshadowed by questions about whether future imperial leadership would maintain support for the technological advancement and international cooperation that had characterized Peter's reign. Craftsmen and foreign experts worried about the security of their positions if conservative factions gained influence through Alexis's eventual succession. Administrative procedures within the palace adapted to accommodate the possibility that future imperial leadership might reverse or modify many of Peter's policies, creating documentation and institutional structures that could survive potential changes in governmental philosophy while preserving essential functions of imperial administration. Family relationships throughout the extended Romanov clan were complicated by the succession tensions as various relatives positioned themselves to benefit from whatever resolution emerged from the conflict between Peter's modernizing agenda and Alexis's traditional inclinations. Palace gatherings became exercises in diplomatic maneuvering as family members attempted to maintain relationships with both current and potential future sources of imperial favor. The palace security systems required constant adjustment to manage the risks associated with factional conflicts that could potentially escalate into more serious threats to imperial stability. Guards maintained surveillance of both foreign visitors and domestic courtiers whose loyalties might be divided between competing visions of Russia's future development. Storage facilities throughout the palace complex accumulated both the technological innovations that represented Peter's legacy and the traditional ceremonial objects that symbolized older Russian values. their coexistence reflecting the cultural tensions that permeated every aspect of court life during this transitional period. Communication networks connecting the palace to provincial administrations carried reports about public reactions to the succession question as regional officials attempted to assess local support for different approaches to imperial leadership while maintaining their own positions regardless of eventual political outcomes. The financial management of palace operations became increasingly complex as resources were allocated between competing priorities that reflected different visions of appropriate imperial spending, with Peter's technological and military projects competing against traditional ceremonial requirements and religious obligations. Educational programs within the palace expanded to accommodate different approaches to preparing future leaders, with some tutors emphasizing technical subjects and practical skills while others focused on classical learning and spiritual development that would support more traditional approaches to imperial authority. The palace libraries accumulated materials that supported both modernizing and conservative approaches to governance. Their collections reflecting the intellectual debates that surrounded questions about Russia's future relationship with European civilization and Orthodox tradition. Diplomatic receptions during this period required careful management to avoid revealing the extent of internal disagreements about imperial succession and governmental philosophy. As foreign observers constantly sought intelligence about Russian political stability that could influence their government's strategic planning, the religious observances within the palace became increasingly significant as different factions emphasized either traditional Orthodox practices or the modified ceremonies that Peter had introduced to accommodate his westernizing reforms. Their competing interpretations of appropriate spiritual expression reflecting broader conflicts about Russian cultural identity. Night watches throughout the palace maintained security while observing the informal meetings and private conversations that revealed the true extent of factional divisions within the imperial court. Their intelligence reports providing Peter with information about potential threats to his authority and his reform agenda. The daily routines that had been established during years of war and construction gradually adapted to peacetime conditions. But the underlying tensions about succession and governmental philosophy prevented the full relaxation that might have been expected after decades of intensive imperial activity and achievements. Palace workshops continued their production of both practical innovations and ceremonial objects. But their output reflected the uncertainty about future imperial priorities that made long-term planning difficult for craftsmen and foreign experts whose careers depended on continued imperial support. The morning conferences that had once focused primarily on military strategy and construction projects increasingly addressed domestic political questions that had been deferred during years of external challenges. Their discussions revealing the complexity of governing an empire that had expanded rapidly while undergoing fundamental internal transformation. As the 1710s progressed toward the final crisis that would resolve the succession question, palace life reflected the growing urgency of decisions that would determine not only the future of the Romanov dynasty, but the entire direction of Russian civilization for generations to come. The tragic resolution of the conflict between Peter and Alexis in 1718 sent shock waves through every corner of the Winter Palace. Picture the Tsar alone in his private study on the morning after his son's death, sitting motionless before a desk covered with unread dispatches, while the early light filtered through windows that overlooked the city he had built from nothing. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of palace servants going about their duties with unusual quietness, as if the entire complex had been muffled by grief and uncertainty. The death of Tsarevich Alexis under mysterious circumstances in the Peter and Paul fortress had eliminated the succession crisis, but at a cost that would haunt Peter for the remainder of his reign. Palace physicians who had attended the imprisoned prince reported conflicting accounts about his final illness. Their whispered conversations in palace corridors revealing doubts and fears that no one dared voice publicly in the presence of a Tsar whose grief had transformed into something far more dangerous. Morning routines throughout the palace adapted to accommodate Peter's altered emotional state. As servants learned to anticipate sudden mood changes that could transform casual requests into angry outbursts, the Tsar's breakfast was often left untouched as he sat staring at architectural drawings or military reports without seeming to comprehend their contents. His mind apparently occupied with thoughts that no advisor dared to interrupt or question. The palace workshops that had once buzzed with Peter's enthusiastic participation now operated with mechanical efficiency, but without the innovative energy that had characterized their previous activities. Foreign craftsmen and technical experts noticed the change immediately as their imperial patron no longer arrived each morning eager to examine new developments or discuss improvements to existing projects. Administrative meetings during the months following Alexis's death revealed Peter's struggle to maintain focus on governmental responsibilities while dealing with personal guilt and political consequences that extended far beyond immediate family relationships. Foreign ambassadors reported that the Tsar seemed aged beyond his years. His legendary energy diminished by emotional burdens that affected his decision-making capabilities. The succession question that had supposedly been resolved by Alexis's death actually became more complicated as Peter now faced the challenge of designating an heir from among remaining family members who lacked both the experience and personal qualities that effective imperial leadership required. Palace discussions about alternative succession arrangements proceeded with extreme delicacy as no one wanted to risk triggering another family crisis. Afternoon activities that had previously included family gatherings and informal consultations with relatives were largely abandoned as Peter withdrew from social interactions that reminded him of the son whose opposition to his reforms had led to such tragic consequences. The palace dining rooms that had once hosted lively debates about imperial policies now served meals in near silence. Evening hours found Peter increasingly isolated in his private apartments, where he would review documents related to Alexis's case, while attempting to understand how their relationship had deteriorated so completely. Palace servants would find him surrounded by letters and testimony from the investigation, his efforts to justify his actions, revealing a man tormented by doubts about decisions that could never be reversed. The international implications of the succession crisis and Alexis's death created new challenges for Russian diplomacy as European courts reassessed their relationships with an empire whose internal stability had been called into question. Palace protocols for receiving foreign visitors required adjustment to manage questions about imperial succession that Peter was reluctant to address publicly. Religious observances within the palace took on heightened significance as Peter sought spiritual guidance for decisions that had placed him in conflict with orthodox traditions about family relationships and paternal authority. The palace chapel became a refuge where the Tsar could attempt to reconcile his role as imperial reformer with his responsibilities as a father and orthodox believer. Cultural activities throughout the palace complex reflected the somber atmosphere that pervaded court life following the family tragedy. Musical performances and theatrical presentations were suspended indefinitely while artistic projects were reduced to essential ceremonial requirements that maintained imperial dignity without suggesting inappropriate celebration. The palace medical staff gained new responsibilities as Peter's physical health began to deteriorate under the stress of emotional trauma and advancing age. Physicians who had previously focused on treating injuries and illnesses now found themselves addressing psychological symptoms that manifested in physical ailments that traditional medicine struggled to understand or treat. Palace security arrangements were enhanced to address potential threats from individuals or factions who might attempt to exploit imperial vulnerability during this period of personal crisis and political uncertainty. Guards maintained heightened surveillance while attempting to preserve the accessibility that Russian traditions demanded of their rulers. Communication systems connecting the palace to provincial administrations carried carefully worded announcements about the succession situation that attempted to maintain confidence in imperial stability while acknowledging the reality of changed circumstances. Regional officials received instructions that emphasized continuity in governmental policies despite uncertainty about future leadership arrangements. The palace libraries became increasingly important as Peter sought historical precedents for the succession laws he was developing to prevent future family conflicts that might threaten dynastic stability. Evening study sessions found him examining accounts of how other European monarchies had managed similar challenges while attempting to adapt their solutions to Russian conditions. Financial management of palace operations required careful attention to expenses that reflected appropriate imperial dignity while avoiding extravagance that might seem inappropriate during a period of national mourning and political uncertainty. Treasury officials worked to balance ceremonial requirements against practical limitations imposed by reduced imperial activity. Educational programs within the palace were suspended temporarily as tutors and advisors reassessed their approaches to preparing potential future leaders. Understanding that previous methods had somehow failed to prevent the tragedy that had eliminated the designated heir and created such profound imperial crisis. Storage facilities throughout the palace complex accumulated materials related to the succession investigation and its aftermath, including documents and personal effects that served as painful reminders of family relationships that had deteriorated beyond repair despite everyone's best intentions. The palace workshops gradually resumed their production activities, but their output reflected changed priorities that emphasized practical necessities over innovative projects that had characterized Peter's earlier enthusiasm for technological advancement and architectural development. Diplomatic receptions during this period required extraordinary skill in managing conversations that touched on sensitive topics related to imperial succession and family relationships. As foreign representatives sought intelligence about Russian political stability while maintaining appropriate diplomatic courtesy and respect. The administrative challenges of governing an empire while dealing with personal trauma and political uncertainty required Peter to develop new approaches to leadership that could function effectively despite his reduced emotional capacity and energy levels that no longer matched the demands of his previous intensive schedule. Palace servants observed changes in daily routines that reflected Peter's altered priorities and capabilities, adapting their services to accommodate irregular schedules and mood variations, while maintaining the essential functions that supported imperial administration and ceremonial requirements. Night watches throughout the palace maintained security while observing the private meetings and confidential consultations that addressed succession planning and political stabilization efforts. Their discretion essential for preserving imperial dignity during a vulnerable period. As Peter's health continued to decline and the succession question remained unresolved, palace life adapted to function as both the center of imperial government and a family residence where personal tragedy had created wounds that would never completely heal. The daily routines established during decades of revolutionary change now served to maintain stability during a crisis that tested every institution and relationship that the Romanov dynasty had built. The final years of Peter's reign were marked by desperate attempts to secure the dynastic succession while completing the governmental and cultural transformation that had defined his entire adult life. Palace activities reflected both the urgency of unfinished business and the melancholy awareness that the great reformer's time was running short. The promulgation of the new succession law in 1722 represented Peter's final attempt to prevent future family conflicts by giving each emperor the right to designate his successor rather than relying on traditional inheritance patterns that might produce unsuitable rulers. Palace ceremonies surrounding the law's announcement emphasized its importance while carefully avoiding references to the personal circumstances that had made such legislation necessary. The morning when Peter announced his decision to crown his wife, Catherine, as empress in 1724 marked a revolutionary moment that surprised even his closest advisors. Picture the Tsar standing before the assembled court in the throne room, his voice steady despite obvious physical weakness as he declared his intention to elevate a former peasant to the highest position in the Russian Empire. Shocking conservative nobles while demonstrating his continued commitment to merit-based advancement over hereditary privilege. The coronation of Empress Catherine revealed Peter's understanding that effective imperial leadership required practical capabilities rather than aristocratic birth, as he publicly celebrated the administrative skills and personal loyalty that his wife had demonstrated during their years of partnership in governing an expanding empire. As Peter's final illness progressed through the winter of 1724-25, palace life adapted to accommodate the reality of approaching imperial transition while maintaining governmental continuity that would preserve the achievements of his revolutionary reign. The daily routines that had been established during decades of intensive reform and expansion now served to ensure stability during the most critical succession moment in Russian history since the time of troubles. The death of Peter the Great on January 28, 1725 marked the end of an era that had transformed Russia beyond recognition. Picture the Winter Palace in those final hours where courtiers moved through marble corridors with hushed footsteps, while the man who had built an empire from swampland drew his last labored breaths. The silence that settled over the palace that morning carried the weight of uncertainty as Russia faced its future without the towering figure who had dominated every aspect of imperial life for over 2 decades. Catherine's elevation from peasant servant to empress of all the Russes represented perhaps the most extraordinary transformation in European royal history. On the morning of her first official day as sole ruler, she stood before the same ornate mirror where Michael Romanov had once trembled as a reluctant boy king, but where Michael had been overwhelmed by inherited responsibility. Catherine radiated the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her position through demonstrated capability rather than accidental birth. Her daily routine as empress began before dawn with private consultations that addressed the immediate challenges of governing an empire whose expansion had outpaced its administrative systems. Palace servants would find her already dressed in simple working clothes, reviewing dispatches from provincial governors while sipping tea from a plain ceramic cup that contrasted sharply with the golden vessels that protocol demanded for public ceremonies. The morning audiences that Catherine conducted revealed her practical approach to imperial administration as she focused on solving immediate problems rather than maintaining elaborate ceremonial traditions that consumed time without producing results. Foreign ambassadors discovered that she preferred direct conversations about trade agreements and territorial boundaries over the elaborate diplomatic courtesies that had characterized previous reigns. Breakfast in the imperial apartments became working meals where Catherine would consult with advisors about everything from military recruitment to agricultural development while consuming simple bread and preserved fruits. Her conversations revealed an understanding of governmental complexities that impressed officials who had initially questioned whether a woman without formal education could effectively manage the diverse challenges of imperial rule. The palace workshops during Catherine's early reign continued their production activities under her direct supervision as she understood that technological innovation and skilled craftsmanship were essential for maintaining the industrial advantages that Peter had worked so hard to establish. Morning inspections of metalwork and textile facilities revealed her detailed knowledge of manufacturing processes that enabled her to identify inefficiencies and suggest improvements. Administrative meetings in the council chambers addressed the pressing need to consolidate territorial gains while developing governmental systems that could effectively administer regions with diverse populations, languages, and cultural traditions. Catherine's approach emphasized practical solutions that addressed local conditions rather than imposing uniform procedures that might work in the capital but prove unsuitable for distant provinces. The palace libraries expanded under Catherine's patronage to include works on governance, economics, and social organization that supported her efforts to understand successful administrative practices from other European kingdoms. Evening study sessions found her examining French and English texts about taxation, legal systems, and commercial regulation while developing policies adapted to Russian conditions and requirements. Diplomatic receptions during this period showcased Catherine's skill at managing international relationships that balanced Russian interests against the competing pressures from neighboring powers who were still adjusting to the empire's enhanced status following Peter's military victories. Palace protocols evolved to accommodate her preference for substantive negotiations over purely ceremonial interactions. The succession question that had troubled Peter's final years remained unresolved as Catherine lacked direct heirs who could continue the Romanov dynasty according to traditional inheritance patterns. Palace discussions about potential successors proceeded with extreme delicacy, understanding that any appearance of instability could invite challenges from domestic opponents or foreign enemies seeking to exploit Russian weakness. Military affairs required Catherine's constant attention as she worked to maintain the professional standards and technological advantages that Peter had established while managing the financial costs of supporting large standing armies across vast territories. Morning briefings with military commanders addressed everything from recruitment policies to equipment procurement, revealing her comprehensive understanding of logistical requirements. The palace medical staff gained new prominence as Catherine's health became a matter of imperial security, with physicians monitoring her condition while developing treatment protocols that balanced traditional Russian healing methods with modern European medical practices. Palace routines adapted to accommodate health requirements while maintaining the demanding schedule that effective governance required. Cultural activities within the palace reflected Catherine's efforts to consolidate the European artistic traditions that Peter had introduced while preserving distinctively Russian elements that provided cultural continuity and national identity. Musical performances and theatrical presentations explored themes that celebrated imperial achievements while reinforcing popular support for continued modernization efforts. Financial management of imperial resources required careful balancing of competing priorities as Catherine worked to fund essential governmental functions while supporting the technological development and military preparedness that Russian security demanded. Palace treasurers developed new accounting procedures that improved oversight of expenditures while maintaining flexibility for responding to unexpected challenges. The palace workshops produced both practical innovations and ceremonial objects that demonstrated Russian technological capabilities while serving diplomatic purposes in exchanges with foreign courts. Catherine's personal involvement in design decisions revealed her understanding that material culture served important political functions in communicating imperial strength and sophistication. Educational initiatives within the palace expanded to include training programs for administrative officials who would implement policies throughout the empire. As Catherine recognized that effective governance required competent personnel at all levels of the bureaucratic hierarchy, these programs combined practical instruction with theoretical knowledge about law, economics, and public administration. Religious observances maintained their central role in palace life while adapting to accommodate Catherine's personal beliefs and the practical requirements of governing a religiously diverse empire. Orthodox ceremonies continued to provide spiritual authority for imperial rule while allowing space for other religious traditions that served various populations within Russian territories. Communication systems connecting the palace to distant provinces improved through Catherine's administrative reforms, which standardized reporting procedures while establishing regular courier schedules that reduced the time required for implementing central government decisions throughout the empire. These improvements enhanced both governmental efficiency and imperial security. Storage facilities throughout the palace complex were reorganized to support expanded governmental activities while preserving historical materials that documented the Romanov dynasty's achievements and provided precedents for future policy decisions. Careful cataloging systems enabled quick access to relevant information during crisis situations. The palace security arrangements evolved to address threats that might target the first female ruler in Russian history, as conservative factions and foreign enemies might view Catherine's gender as evidence of imperial weakness that could be exploited through direct action or political manipulation. Night watches maintained surveillance of both domestic and foreign individuals whose activities might threaten imperial stability, while palace staff adapted their routines to support irregular schedules that resulted from urgent governmental business and health considerations that affected Catherine's daily activities. As Catherine's brief reign progressed through 1725 and into early 1727, palace life reflected both the stability that her competent administration provided and the underlying uncertainty about long-term dynastic succession that would eventually require resolution through difficult political decisions. The death of Catherine I in May 1727 precipitated another succession crisis that tested the institutional structures that Peter and Catherine had established during their revolutionary transformation of Russian government and society. The palace once again became the center of intense negotiations between competing factions seeking to control imperial succession and determine the future direction of Russian development. The elevation of 12-year-old Peter II to the throne represented a return to traditional hereditary succession patterns while creating immediate challenges associated with regency governance during the new emperor's minority. Palace life adapted to accommodate child rulership while maintaining the essential functions of imperial administration that could not be suspended regardless of the ruler's age or capabilities. Morning routines in the palace during Peter II's early reign centered around educational activities designed to prepare the young emperor for his future responsibilities while managing the immediate demands of governing a vast empire through regency councils and advisory committees. Palace tutors worked to balance traditional academic subjects with practical instruction about governmental procedures and imperial protocols. The regency arrangements that governed during Peter II's minority revealed ongoing tensions between different approaches to Russian development as competing factions promoted either continued westernization or return to more traditional Orthodox and Slavic cultural values. Palace meetings between regency council members often reflected broader debates about national identity and governmental philosophy. Administrative procedures adapted to accommodate collective decision-making processes that replaced individual imperial authority. While palace protocols evolved to maintain appropriate dignity for ceremonial occasions involving a child emperor who lacked the personal presence and experience that had characterized previous rulers. The palace workshops continued their production activities under regency supervision, but their output reflected reduced innovation and increased emphasis on traditional ceremonial objects that symbolized dynastic continuity rather than technological advancement. Foreign craftsmen and technical experts faced uncertainty about their future roles in an administration that might prioritize different values and objectives. Educational programs within the palace expanded to include instruction for court officials and regional administrators who needed updated training in governmental procedures and policy implementation as the regency councils worked to maintain administrative continuity while preparing for eventual return to direct imperial rule. Military affairs during the regency period required careful management to maintain defensive capabilities while avoiding provocative actions that might invite foreign challenges to Russian territory or political stability. Palace briefings addressed both immediate security concerns and long-term strategic planning that would guide imperial policy during the transition to adult rulership. The palace libraries accumulated materials related to regency governance and minority rulership that provided historical precedents for managing similar situations while preserving the governmental innovations that had been developed during previous reigns. Evening consultations found regency council members examining these resources while developing policies appropriate for contemporary conditions. Cultural activities within the palace reflected efforts to maintain imperial dignity and public confidence while acknowledging the unique circumstances created by child rulership. Ceremonial occasions were carefully planned to emphasize dynastic legitimacy and governmental stability rather than personal imperial authority that the young emperor could not yet effectively exercise. Diplomatic receptions during this period required extraordinary skill in managing foreign relationships that balanced Russian interests against potential exploitation of perceived weakness associated with minority rule and regency governance. Palace protocols emphasized institutional continuity while downplaying individual leadership capabilities that might invite foreign pressure or interference. Financial management of imperial resources became increasingly complex as regency councils attempted to balance competing priorities while maintaining fiscal responsibility and avoiding expenditures that might be criticized as inappropriate during a period of transitional governance. Palace treasurers developed new oversight procedures that ensured accountability while preserving flexibility for responding to unexpected challenges. The palace medical staff maintained responsibility for the young emperor's health while also serving other members of the imperial family and court officials whose well-being affected governmental stability. Medical facilities within the palace expanded to accommodate increased attention to preventive care and health monitoring that minority rulership required. Religious observances gained heightened importance as sources of spiritual guidance and political legitimacy during a period when temporal authority was exercised through institutional arrangements rather than personal imperial charisma. Palace chapel services emphasized divine support for the Romanov dynasty while providing moral framework for regency decision-making. Communication systems throughout the empire carried carefully crafted announcements about imperial succession and regency arrangements that maintained public confidence while acknowledging changed circumstances. Regional officials received detailed instructions about implementing policies during the transition period while preserving essential governmental functions. The gradual maturation of Peter II created new challenges as the young emperor began asserting personal preferences that sometimes conflicted with Regency Council recommendations, leading to palace tensions between institutional governance and emerging imperial will that would need resolution as the emperor approached adulthood. Palace security arrangements evolved to protect both the young emperor and the regency officials whose authority might be challenged by domestic opponents or foreign agents seeking to exploit Russian political vulnerability during this transitional period. Enhanced surveillance and protective procedures became standard elements of daily palace operations. Storage facilities throughout the palace complex preserved documents and materials related to regency governance while maintaining access to historical precedents and legal authorities that supported institutional decision-making during the minority period. Careful organization enabled quick reference to relevant information during policy discussions and crisis situations. The morning when 15-year-old Peter II announced his intention to move the imperial court back to Moscow marked a dramatic break with his grandfather's westernizing policies and signaled the beginning of a conservative reaction that would influence Russian development for the remainder of his brief reign. Palace activities adapted to support this geographical transition while managing the political implications of abandoning St. Petersburg as the primary center of imperial power. The death of Peter II from smallpox in January 1730, just 3 years into his personal rule, eliminated the direct male line of Romanov succession and precipitated the most serious dynastic crisis since the time of troubles. Palace life once again centered around urgent negotiations between competing clans and their supporters. As the future of the Russian Empire hung in the balance while various factions maneuvered for control of imperial succession, the invitation extended to Anna Ivanova, daughter of Ivan V and niece of Peter the Great, to assume the imperial throne represented a compromise solution that attempted to balance competing claims while addressing concerns about governmental stability and dynastic legitimacy. Her acceptance of constitutional limitations on imperial authority marked an unprecedented experiment in restricted monarchy that would transform palace life and imperial governance in fundamental ways. The conditions imposed on Anna's rulership by the Supreme Privy Council created new administrative structures that limited traditional imperial prerogatives while establishing collective oversight of governmental decisions. Palace protocols evolved to accommodate shared authority between the empress and council members, creating unprecedented complexity in daily operations and decision-making processes. Morning audiences during Anna's early reign reflected the tension between constitutional restrictions and imperial dignity as the empress attempted to maintain appropriate royal authority while operating within limitations that had never before constrained Russian rulers. Palace meetings between Anna and council members revealed ongoing negotiations about the practical implementation of constitutional monarchy in an empire accustomed to absolute rule. The palace workshops and cultural activities during this period reflected uncertainty about long-term imperial priorities as constitutional limitations made it difficult to plan major projects or implement comprehensive policies that required sustained imperial commitment and resources. Artists and craftsmen faced reduced patronage while awaiting clarification about governmental direction and imperial preferences. Administrative procedures throughout the palace complex adapted to accommodate collective decision-making that slowed policy implementation while theoretically improving governmental oversight and accountability. Palace bureaucracies developed new documentation requirements that tracked council participation in imperial decisions while preserving essential records for future reference. The eventual abolition of constitutional restrictions in 1732, when Anna successfully reasserted absolute imperial authority, marked the end of Russia's brief experiment with limited monarchy and the restoration of traditional autocratic governance. Palace life quickly readjusted to accommodate renewed imperial prerogatives while maintaining some administrative innovations that had proven beneficial during the constitutional period. The remaining years of Anna's reign saw palace activities focus on consolidating imperial authority while addressing the governmental challenges that had accumulated during periods of weak leadership and institutional uncertainty. Daily routines within the palace complex reflected both the relief of restored stability and the ongoing work required to rebuild imperial effectiveness and international credibility that had been diminished by succession crisis and constitutional experiments. As the 1730s progressed toward Anna's death and another inevitable succession crisis, palace life served as both the center of imperial government and a reminder of the persistent vulnerabilities that threatened Romanov dynastic stability whenever strong personal leadership was absent or constrained by institutional limitations that had not been designed for the practical requirements of governing a vast diverse empire. The death of Anna Ivanovna in October 1740 brought forth yet another succession crisis, but this time with a twist that would reshape palace life in ways no one could have anticipated. Picture the Winter Palace on that autumn morning when 2-month-old Ivan VI was proclaimed emperor. His infant cries echoing through chambers where the weight of imperial authority had never before rested on such tiny shoulders. The palace nursery became the unexpected center of Russian power where wet nurses and pediatric physicians suddenly found themselves among the most important figures in the empire. The Regency of Neapol transformed daily palace routines around the rhythms of infant care as governmental meetings were scheduled between feeding times and nap schedules. Morning audiences took place in chambers adjacent to the nursery, where the sound of a crying baby could interrupt the most serious diplomatic negotiations. Foreign ambassadors found themselves discussing treaty arrangements while palace servants hurried past carrying swaddling clothes and warm milk. The surreal juxtaposition of imperial dignity with domestic necessity, creating an atmosphere unlike anything in Russian history. Palace physicians gained unprecedented authority as the infant emperor's health became a matter of national security, with medical consultations determining everything from room temperature to visitor restrictions. The morning ritual of examining the baby emperor was attended by ministers of state who had once focused on military strategy and economic policy, their grave faces studying infant reflexes and feeding patterns with the intensity previously reserved for battle plans and treasury reports. Administrative procedures adapted to accommodate governance that operated around the biological needs of a ruler who could neither speak nor understand the decisions being made in his name. Palace scribes documented every aspect of the infant's daily routine while simultaneously maintaining the flow of governmental correspondence that kept the empire functioning despite the unprecedented circumstances of baby rulership. The palace workshops produced miniature versions of imperial regalia alongside traditional ceremonial objects as craftsmen struggled to create symbols of authority that could somehow be adapted to an emperor whose hands were too small to hold a scepter and whose head required specially designed crowns that wouldn't slip over his eyes. These diminutive imperial accessories served symbolic purposes while highlighting the absurdity of the political situation. Religious ceremonies within the palace chapel were modified to accommodate an emperor who slept through most services and required constant attention from nurses who had become inadvertent participants in state functions. Orthodox priests found themselves blessing an infant who responded to their solemn invocations with babbling and occasional digestive disruptions that tested the dignity of even the most elaborate ceremonial occasions. The palace nursery staff wielded influence that rivaled senior government ministers as their opinions about the infant emperor's needs could determine scheduling for the entire imperial administration. Morning conferences between regency officials and head nurses revealed the strange reality of governance where questions about sleep schedules carried the same weight as discussions about foreign policy and military deployment. International diplomatic relations became increasingly complicated as foreign courts struggled to understand how to conduct serious negotiations with a government centered around infant care. Palace receptions for ambassadors required careful timing to avoid disrupting the baby emperor's routine. While ceremonial protocols were constantly adjusted to accommodate the practical limitations imposed by ruling through a child who measured his reign in weeks rather than years. The palace security arrangements evolved to protect not just imperial authority, but an actual baby whose vulnerability was both personal and political. Guards learned to distinguish between normal infant crying and sounds that might indicate health problems requiring immediate medical attention. Their traditional military training supplemented by crash courses in child care that would have seemed ridiculous under any other circumstances. Cultural activities within the palace were suspended indefinitely as it seemed inappropriate to host elaborate entertainments, while governance centered around diaper changes and feeding schedules. The throne room was rarely used for formal ceremonies, with most official business conducted in smaller chambers where the sounds of infant care wouldn't disturb sleeping royalty or interrupt important meetings. The morning when Elizabeth Petrovna marched into the palace with her supporters in November 1741 marked the end of the most unusual period in Russian imperial history. Picture the moment when adult authority returned to government as Elizabeth strode through corridors where the previous day's most important concerns had involved infant feeding schedules and nursery temperature control. Her decisive action, restoring traditional imperial dignity to a throne that had been reduced to baby furniture. Elizabeth's coronation ceremony in April 1742 celebrated not just her personal ascension, but the restoration of competent adult leadership to an empire that had endured years of regency governance and institutional uncertainty. The morning of her crowning found the Winter Palace transformed back into a proper center of imperial power, where serious governmental business could proceed without accommodation to infant biological needs or constitutional restrictions that had proven unsuitable for practical administration. Her daily routine as empress began with morning prayers that lasted precisely long enough to seek divine guidance without consuming time needed for the pressing governmental business that had accumulated during years of ineffective leadership. Palace servants discovered that Elizabeth preferred efficiency over elaborate ceremony. Understanding that Russia required active governance rather than symbolic displays that impressed visitors while neglecting practical administrative responsibilities. Breakfast in the imperial apartments became working sessions where Elizabeth would review overnight dispatches from provincial governors while consuming simple meals that provided energy for demanding schedules rather than ceremonial displays of imperial luxury. Her conversations with advisors revealed comprehensive understanding of problems that had developed during previous reigns while demonstrating determination to address challenges through direct action rather than lengthy deliberation. The palace workshops resumed full production under Elizabeth's personal supervision as she understood that Russian prestige required demonstration of technological capabilities and artistic sophistication that could compete with the most advanced European courts. Morning inspections of craft facilities revealed her detailed knowledge of manufacturing processes and her insistence on quality standards that would enhance rather than diminish imperial reputation. Administrative meetings in the council chambers addressed the urgent need to rebuild institutional effectiveness while consolidating territorial integrity that had been threatened by political instability and weak leadership during the previous decade. Elizabeth's approach emphasized practical solutions that addressed immediate problems while establishing foundations for long-term governmental improvements and territorial security. The palace libraries expanded under Elizabeth's patronage to include contemporary European works on governance, military science, and cultural development that supported her efforts to restore Russian competitiveness with neighboring powers who had gained advantages during periods of imperial weakness. Evening study sessions found her examining successful policies from other kingdoms while adapting their innovations to Russian conditions and capabilities. Diplomatic receptions during Elizabeth's early reign demonstrated her commitment to restoring Russian international credibility through competent governance and reliable policy implementation rather than dramatic gestures or constitutional experiments that had confused foreign observers about imperial intentions and capabilities. Palace protocols emphasized substance over ceremony while maintaining appropriate dignity for a major European power. Military affairs received Elizabeth's immediate attention as she worked to rebuild professional standards and technological capabilities that had deteriorated during years of political uncertainty and divided authority. Morning briefings with commanders addressed recruitment, training, and equipment needs while developing strategic plans that would protect Russian interests and deter potential aggression from neighboring powers seeking to exploit perceived weakness. The palace medical staff adapted to serve an empress whose health directly affected governmental stability, developing treatment protocols that balanced traditional Russian healing methods with modern European medical practices, while maintaining the confidentiality necessary to prevent political exploitation of health concerns by domestic opponents or foreign enemies. Cultural activities within the palace resumed with elaborate celebrations that demonstrated Russian sophistication while reinforcing popular support for restored imperial authority. Elizabeth's patronage of arts and entertainment created employment for musicians, artists, and performers while showcasing cultural achievements that enhanced international respect for Russian civilization and imperial leadership. Financial management of imperial resources required careful attention to expenses that had been neglected during previous reigns while funding essential governmental functions and defensive preparations that Russian security demanded. Palace treasurers developed new accounting procedures that improved oversight while maintaining flexibility for responding to unexpected opportunities or challenges. The palace workshops produced both practical innovations and luxury goods that demonstrated Russian technological capabilities while serving diplomatic purposes in exchanges with foreign courts. Elizabeth's involvement in design decisions revealed her understanding that material culture communicated imperial strength and sophistication to international audiences whose opinions influenced diplomatic relationships and commercial opportunities. Educational initiatives within the palace expanded to include advanced training for administrative officials and military officers who would implement policies throughout the empire. As Elizabeth recognized that effective governance required competent personnel at all levels of the bureaucratic and military hierarchies, these programs combined practical instruction with theoretical knowledge about law, economics, and strategic planning. Religious observances maintained their central role in palace life while supporting Elizabeth's efforts to strengthen Orthodox identity and cultural distinctiveness that differentiated Russian civilization from Western European influences that some viewed as threats to traditional values and spiritual authority. Morning chapel services provided both personal spiritual guidance and public demonstration of imperial commitment to Orthodox principles. Communication systems connecting the palace to distant provinces improved through administrative reforms that standardized reporting procedures while establishing regular information flows that enhanced central government understanding of local conditions and regional challenges. These improvements increased both governmental efficiency and imperial security by reducing response times for crisis situations. Storage facilities throughout the palace complex were reorganized to support expanded governmental activities while preserving historical materials and legal precedents that provided guidance for policy decisions and administrative procedures. Improved cataloging systems enabled quick access to relevant information during planning sessions and emergency consultations. The palace security arrangements evolved to address both traditional threats and new challenges associated with Elizabeth's gender and unmarried status, as various factions might attempt to influence imperial policy through marriage proposals or personal relationships that could compromise governmental independence and decision-making authority. Night watches maintained surveillance of domestic and foreign individuals whose activities might threaten imperial stability, while palace staff adapted their routines to support Elizabeth's preference for evening consultations and late-night planning sessions that addressed sensitive political and military matters requiring confidential discussion. Morning routines during the late 1740s reflected Elizabeth's growing confidence in her administrative capabilities and her commitment to policies that would strengthen Russian power while maintaining cultural traditions that provided national identity and popular legitimacy. Palace activities balanced innovation with continuity, demonstrating that effective modernization could enhance rather than replace valuable Russian characteristics. The palace workshops during this period produced increasingly sophisticated goods that rivaled the finest European craftsmanship while maintaining distinctively Russian artistic elements that expressed national pride and cultural independence. Elizabeth's personal involvement in artistic projects revealed her understanding that cultural achievements served important political purposes in establishing international respect and domestic support. Administrative procedures throughout the palace complex evolved to support more efficient governmental operations while preserving accountability mechanisms that prevented corruption and abuse of authority. Palace bureaucracies developed standardized methods for handling routine business while maintaining flexibility for addressing unusual situations and emergency requirements. The diplomatic receptions hosted during Elizabeth's mature reign showcased Russian prosperity and cultural sophistication while facilitating negotiations that advanced imperial interests and strengthened international relationships. Palace protocols demonstrated that competent governance could maintain Russian distinctiveness while engaging productively with European diplomatic and commercial networks. Military planning sessions in the palace war rooms addressed both defensive requirements and expansion opportunities as Russian power recovered from previous weakness and political instability. Elizabeth's strategic vision encompassed territorial consolidation and alliance relationships that would enhance security while positioning Russia for future growth and international influence. The palace medical facilities expanded to serve not only the imperial family but also foreign dignitaries and court officials whose health affected governmental operations and diplomatic relationships. Medical innovations developed within the palace complex often influenced healthcare practices throughout the empire while demonstrating Russian advancement in scientific knowledge and practical application. Cultural programs within the palace attracted artists and intellectuals from throughout Europe, creating an international community that enhanced Russian cultural prestige while providing opportunities for learning and innovation that strengthened imperial capabilities in various fields. Evening entertainments combined Russian traditions with European influences, creating distinctive cultural expressions that reflected Elizabeth's vision of modernized Russian civilization. The palace libraries became centers of learning that supported both governmental decision-making and cultural development, accumulating materials that enabled Russian scholars and officials to remain current with international developments while preserving knowledge about Russian history and traditions. These collections served practical administrative needs while supporting intellectual activities that enhanced imperial reputation. Financial administration within the palace complex reflected Elizabeth's commitment to fiscal responsibility while funding the cultural and military programs that enhanced Russian strength and international standing. Treasury operations balanced immediate expenses against long-term investment in capabilities that would serve imperial interests for generations. As Elizabeth's reign progressed through the 1750s toward its eventual conclusion, palace life embodied the successful restoration of effective imperial governance that had transformed Russia from political instability into renewed strength and international respect. The daily routines established within the Winter Palace walls provided foundations for achievements that would influence Russian development and European relationships for decades to come. The morning in January 1762, when news arrived of Elizabeth's sudden death, found the palace once again facing succession uncertainty, but this time with institutional structures and administrative capabilities that had been strengthened during 2 decades of competent governance. Palace preparations for another imperial transition reflected both the experience gained from previous crises and the confidence that Russian governmental systems could maintain stability regardless of individual leadership changes. The brief reign of Peter III revealed how quickly competent administration could be undermined by a poor decision-making and political miscalculation as palace life adapted to accommodate an emperor whose policies alienated key constituencies while threatening alliances and territorial gains that previous rulers had worked decades to achieve. The palace workshops and cultural activities during Peter III's 6-month reign reflected the uncertainty created by dramatic policy reversals and erratic decision-making that confused both domestic officials and foreign observers about Russian intentions and capabilities. Court life struggled to maintain dignity and effectiveness while accommodating imperial behavior that seemed inconsistent with traditional Russian interests and values. The morning of June 28, 1762, when Catherine II assumed power through the carefully orchestrated coup that removed her husband from the throne, marked the beginning of the most transformative period in Russian imperial history since Peter the Great's revolutionary changes in the early 18th century. Palace life would soon reflect the vision and capabilities of a ruler whose intelligence, determination, and political skill would earn her recognition as Catherine the Great and establish Russia as the dominant power in Eastern Europe. The coronation of Catherine II on September 22, 1762 transformed the Winter Palace into a stage for one of history's most remarkable displays of imperial ambition. Realized. Picture the moment when the crown touched her brow in the cathedral. The weight of gold and precious stones, nothing compared to the weight of possibilities that settled on her shoulders. She had arrived in Russia as a minor German princess with little more than intelligence and determination. Yet here she stood, crowned empress of the largest empire on earth through sheer force of will and political genius. Her first morning as undisputed ruler began before dawn in the private study that would become the nerve center of an empire spanning 11 time zones. The room bore little resemblance to the ornate ceremonial chambers that visitors expected. Furnished instead with practical works covered in maps, correspondence, and the leather-bound notebooks where Catherine recorded her thoughts on everything from legal reform to agricultural innovation. She preferred to begin each day in simple morning dress, her hair unpowdered and her hands already stained with ink from the correspondence she'd been reviewing since 4 o'clock. Breakfast was consumed while reading dispatches from provincial governors. The routine meal of blackberry and honey interrupted by frequent pauses to make marginal notes or draft immediate responses to urgent situations. Palace servants learned to anticipate her needs without interrupting her concentration, quietly refilling her tea glass while she absorbed reports about grain harvests in Ukraine, Cossack movements along the southern borders, and diplomatic communications from courts across Europe that were still adjusting to the reality of female rule in Russia. The morning audiences that Catherine conducted revealed her systematic approach to understanding every aspect of imperial administration. Where previous rulers had relied on summaries prepared by advisors, she insisted on meeting directly with officials from various departments to hear first-hand accounts of conditions throughout the empire. Palace protocols adapted to accommodate sessions that might last several hours as Catherine questioned military commanders about troop readiness, interrogated treasury officials about revenue collections, and consulted with legal experts about administrative procedures that required clarification or reform. These detailed consultations revealed Catherine's extraordinary capacity for absorbing and processing complex information as she demonstrated familiarity with obscure regulations governing everything from monastery land holdings to customs procedures at remote border crossings. Palace observers noted her ability to recall specific details from previous conversations while connecting seemingly unrelated issues to broader patterns that revealed systemic problems requiring comprehensive solutions. The palace workshops during Catherine's early reign buzzed with activity as she commissioned detailed maps, architectural surveys, and technical studies that would support the ambitious reform program she was developing. Morning inspections of these facilities found her examining everything from printing equipment to surveying instruments. Her questions revealing both practical understanding of technical processes and strategic vision about how improved capabilities could enhance governmental effectiveness. Administrative meetings in the council chambers addressed the fundamental challenge of governing territories so vast that communications between the capital and distant provinces required months to complete. Catherine's approach emphasized systematic documentation and standardized procedures that could function effectively despite the enormous distances and cultural diversity that characterized her empire. Palace scribes worked in shifts to maintain correspondence with hundreds of regional officials while developing the administrative innovations that would transform Russian governance. The legal reforms that Catherine began drafting during her first years as empress required extensive consultation with scholars, judges, and administrators who understood the practical challenges of implementing consistent legal standards across territories with different traditions, languages, and social systems. Evening sessions in the palace library found her comparing legal codes from various European kingdoms while developing principles that could be adapted to Russian conditions without abandoning valuable local customs and practices. The palace medical facilities expanded during this period to serve not only the imperial court but also to support Catherine's interest in public health initiatives that could improve conditions throughout the empire. Morning consultations with physicians addressed both personal health concerns and broader questions about disease prevention, medical education, and health care delivery in remote regions where traditional medical knowledge was limited or ineffective. Cultural activities within the palace reflected Catherine's vision of Russia as a sophisticated European power that could compete intellectually and artistically with the most advanced civilizations. She established regular evening salons where foreign intellectuals mingled with Russian scholars. Their conversations exploring philosophical questions and practical problems while creating international networks that enhanced Russia's cultural prestige and intellectual development. The palace libraries became centers of learning that accumulated materials from across Europe and Asia, supporting both governmental research and cultural advancement. Catherine's personal collection included works in French, German, and English alongside Russian texts. Her multilingual capabilities, enabling her to engage directly with contemporary European thought while developing distinctively Russian approaches to governance and social organization. Diplomatic receptions during Catherine's reign demonstrated her skill at managing international relationships that balanced Russian expansion with European stability. Palace protocols evolved to accommodate negotiations that might involve multiple languages and cultural traditions. As Catherine's territorial ambitions required careful coordination with allies while deterring potential enemies through displays of imperial strength and diplomatic sophistication. Military planning sessions addressed the complex requirements of defending and expanding an empire that bordered both European kingdoms and Asian territories with different strategic challenges and opportunities. Catherine's approach to military affairs emphasized professional competence and technological advancement while maintaining the warrior traditions that had enabled previous Russian victories against seemingly superior enemies. The palace workshops produced both practical innovations and luxury goods that demonstrated Russian technological capabilities while serving diplomatic purposes in relationships with foreign courts. Catherine's involvement in design decisions reflected her understanding that material culture communicated imperial authority and cultural sophistication to international audiences whose opinions influenced commercial opportunities and political alliances. Financial administration within the palace required careful management of resources that supported both essential governmental functions and ambitious development projects that would enhance Russian capabilities for generations. Treasury operations balanced immediate expenses against long-term investments in infrastructure, education, and military preparedness that Catherine considered essential for imperial security and prosperity. Religious observances within the palace maintained their traditional role while adapting to accommodate Catherine's more cosmopolitan outlook and her commitment to religious tolerance that would eventually extend legal protections to various faith communities throughout the empire. Morning chapel services provided spiritual guidance while avoiding the sectarian conflicts that had troubled previous reigns. Communication systems connecting the palace to distant territories improved dramatically as Catherine implemented administrative reforms that standardized reporting procedures while reducing response times for governmental decisions. These innovations enhanced both efficiency and security by enabling central authorities to address problems before they escalated into serious threats to imperial stability. The palace security arrangements evolved to address both traditional concerns and new challenges associated with Catherine's ambitious reform agenda, which threatened established interests and could potentially trigger resistance from conservative factions or foreign powers seeking to exploit domestic instability. Enhanced surveillance capabilities protected imperial authority while gathering intelligence about potential threats. Storage facilities throughout the palace complex were reorganized to support expanded governmental activities while preserving historical materials that provided precedents for legal and administrative innovations. Improved cataloging systems enabled quick access to relevant information during policy development and crisis management situations that required immediate reference to established procedures. Educational programs within the palace expanded to include advanced training for officials who would implement Catherine's reforms throughout the empire, combining theoretical knowledge with practical instruction about administrative procedures and policy implementation. These initiatives reflected her understanding that effective governance required competent personnel at all levels of the bureaucratic hierarchy. The morning routines established during Catherine's first decade as empress provided foundations for achievements that would transform Russia into a major European power while expanding imperial territories to their greatest historical extent. Palace life embodied the systematic approach and intellectual sophistication that characterized her entire reign, demonstrating that effective leadership could overcome seemingly impossible challenges through careful planning, comprehensive knowledge, and unwavering determination. The daily rhythms within the Winter Palace walls reflected Catherine's vision of modernized imperial governance that combined practical effectiveness with cultural sophistication, establishing patterns that would influence Russian development long after her remarkable reign had ended. Her transformation from foreign princess to Catherine the Great represented one of history's most extraordinary examples of individual capability, triumphing over circumstances that should have limited her to ceremonial irrelevance. As the 1770s progressed and Catherine's reforms began producing measurable improvements in imperial administration and territorial security, palace life served as both the command center of expanding Russian power and the cultural heart of a civilization that was earning international respect through achievement rather than mere pretension. The morning conferences and evening salons, the administrative innovations and cultural patronage all contributed to accomplishments that would establish Russia as a dominant force in European affairs while creating foundations for continued development and expansion. The woman who had entered Russia speaking no Russian and understanding little about the empire she would eventually rule had systematically transformed herself into one of history's most effective and visionary leaders, proving that intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking could overcome any obstacle while creating lasting achievements that would influence world history for centuries to come. And so our journey through the glittering corridors of Imperial Russia draws to a close, friend. We've walked alongside the Romanovs for over 3 centuries, watching as a shy 16-year-old boy named Michael grew into the founder of a dynasty, witnessing Peter the Great transform a medieval kingdom into a European empire, and following Catherine the Great as she expanded Russian power to its zenith. Through these palace walls, we've seen how the quiet rhythms of daily life shaped the destiny of millions. The morning prayers and evening consultations, the diplomatic receptions and family dinners, the workshop innovations and library studies, all wove together into the grand tapestry of Russian imperial history. Each Romanov ruler brought their own vision to these marble halls. Yet all were bound by the weight of tradition and the endless demands of governing the world's largest empire. The palace routines we've explored tonight reveal that history isn't just made in dramatic moments of war and revolution, but in the countless small decisions, personal relationships, and daily choices that accumulate across generations. From Michael's reluctant acceptance of the crown to Catherine's ambitious reforms, the Romanovs learned that ruling an empire required not just ceremonial authority, but practical wisdom, cultural sophistication, and the ability to adapt ancient traditions to changing times. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll dream of those winter mornings in St. Petersburg, where the sound of footsteps on marble floors marked the beginning of another day in the life of an empire that would endure for 3 centuries before finally succumbing to the forces of change that even the mightiest dynasty could not withstand. Sweet dreams, and thank you for sharing this peaceful journey through the remarkable world of Imperial Russia.